Chapter 714. Seeing that drop of blood, many people couldn't help but exclaim. Nan Wang was about to come over to have a look, but he stopped as if he thought of something. Jing Jiao waved his hand, indicating that he didn't need to pay attention to it. He looked at Fang Jingtian and asked, "Now that your master is dead, what do you think?" Fang Jingtian thought for a long time and said, "If I can cure my injury, I will still find a way to take revenge." Jing Jiao asked, "What if I have already left by then?" Everyone knew that he was talking about ascending. Strangely enough, no matter whether it was the disciples of Aoyama or the cultivators of other sects, they never doubted whether he could ascend again from the moment they confirmed that he was the immortal Jingyang. Fang Jingtian said, "Then everything will be over. Then take the three of them to Shilai Peak to rest," Jing Jiao said, pointing to the three reclusive elders who had walked out of the hermit peaks. Fang Jingtian was silent for a while and said, "Yes, Uncle Master." His silver eyebrows danced in the night wind, looking like the stream of sword washing in the distance. Jing Jiao turned to look at Guinan Shan and said, "You arranged for someone to clean up." He didn't mean the Taoist hall of Shilai Peak, but the peaks of Aoyama. Today, the peaks had suffered several catastrophes. Many cliffs had collapsed, and at least tens of thousands of ancient trees had been broken. It was a scene of desolation. The fairyland of Taoism in the past was nowhere to be seen. Even though the Aoyama sect was full of cultivation practitioners, it would take a long time to repair these things. Everyone knew that Jing Jiao had chosen Gu Qing as the next sect master, but now he asked Guinan Shan to do these things, which inevitably led to some speculation. Only Guinan Shan and the people of Shima Peak knew that it was because he had more important things for Gu Qing to do. Back at the Shima Peak, Jing Jiao ascertained that Gu Qing wouldn't die anytime soon, even though he was severely wounded. He told Gu Qing a few things and then drove him back to Zhaoga City. Looking at the solemn expression on Gu Qing's face as he left and the drop of blood on Jing Jiao's earlobe, the atmosphere at the top of Shima Peak became even more tense. With a soft thud, the drop of blood fell to the ground. A part of Jing Jiao's earlobe was missing. Seeing this scene, everyone was extremely shocked. Over the past 100 years, no matter how strong Jing Jiao had encountered or how badly injured he had been, it had been difficult for his body to have any wounds. It was because he was the reincarnation of the all-in-one sword. However, he had suffered a severe injury in the heaven-shaking duel with Nanchu back then, and a part of his earlobe was cut off. A similar scene had happened again today. How badly was he injured today? Zhao Leiyu was prepared for this. She arrived by Jing Jiao's side after a few sword lights came out from her sleeve. She reached out her right hand as fast as lightning and pinched his earlobe. "I won't die," said Jing Jiao. He had destroyed the sword formation of Aoyama, killed his big brother, and lifted the sword-washing stream to hit the fairy lady. He had to pay a price for it. Since he said he wouldn't die, it meant that he wouldn't die. However, Lu Shui and the others couldn't set their minds at ease, especially when they found Jing Jiao had a grave expression on his face. This was a rare emotion for Jing Jiao. It was well known that neither Taiping Jinren came to Jing Jiao's side through Lu Shui nor the fairy lady descended from the sky that day. It was probably because Jing Jiao had expected those events, but what he was thinking about at the moment was something beyond the sand table. What's going on? Why is the atmosphere so depressing? Haven't we won yet? Zhuo Rizhui thought that even though Aoyama had been turned into a garbage dump and the sword formation in Shanga Peak had paid a heavy price, they had killed the great Grandmaster Taiping, eliminated the greatest threat of the Aoyama sect, and killed the fairy lady of Zhongzhou School and Bai Jinren, achieving an unimaginable victory. As the gentle wind blew, Apiao appeared in front of Jing Jiao. Jing Jiao said, "Chao Yuan should be in the East Ocean. You go and tell him that Bai Yuan might have entered the underworld. Take him to the underworld and try to kill her." The black hair on Apiao's forehead tousled slightly as she said nervously, "Even if I bring the Broadsword King with me, I don't think we can kill Bai Jinren." Jing Jiao said, "Tong Yin is in the underworld. Let him persuade the underworld master to join us. He was taught by Bai Jinren, so he should know how to kill him." The drifter sighed and said, "All right, but how can I go there?" Jing Jiao said, "Shuiyu Nunnery's sedan is waiting for you outside the mountain. I've talked to the chief nun about it." It turned out that the conversation before the departure of the small green curtained sedan had a deeper meaning. Apiao walked out of the cliff and drifted forward in the ocean of clouds, soon disappearing into the starry night. Yet, the group was more surprised by another matter. By now, they realized that Bai Zhenren was not dead. What was the reason for the dispersed clouds and fog? Zhao Liu asked, "Is it possible that the person in the clouds and fog is a substitute? How could he hide it from you and the immortal Tan? And why did the immortal Tan spit up blood in the end?" "The pagoda of suppressing devils is quite peculiar," said Jing Jiao. "It should be a counterattack set up by Bai Yuan for him." The immortal Tan was indeed wounded severely. Zhao Liu said while staring into his eyes, "If Bai Zhenren is still alive, it means that he hasn't finished his work yet." Jing Jiao walked to the edge of the cliff and looked at the distance under the starry sky, saying, "It's more likely that all his previous work has been wasted." Zhao Liu followed him to the edge of the cliff while pinching his earlobe. She followed his line of sight and looked at the distance, murmuring, "What does he intend to do? That patch of clouds and fog must be an advanced magic method of the Zhongzhou school, and the forbidding formation on the immortal Tan was set up on the pagoda of suppressing devils." All these indicated that Bai Zhenren had predicted everything. But, since she had predicted everything, why did she come to Aoyama so calmly and invite the fairy lady by run back according to Jing Jiao's prediction? Regardless of how much benefit her scheme could bring to the Zhongzhou school, it was not worth the loss of a fairy lady. Jing Jiao patted the back of her hand, indicating that she could let go of it now. Zhao Liu pulled back her right hand and wiped it on her sleeve. Jing Jiao turned to Cain Yang and said, "Tong Yin won't come back for a while. You play a game of Go with me." Nobody knew why he suddenly wanted to play Go at such a critical moment. Even the #1 chess player in the world, Tong Yin, was no match for him. But the people on Shima Peak were well aware that he had never liked playing Go. Lu Shisui suddenly recalled that his young master, who also didn't like music, suddenly played a piece of music on the bone flute outside Jiaoga City last year. Was there a connection between the two events? Cain Yang didn't know why her teacher wanted to play Go, but she didn't feel as excited as before. She walked over anxiously. Yuan Chu brought out a table and a stool as quickly as he could. Jing Jiao took out a bamboo chair and lay down on it tiredly, saying, "You go first." Cain Yang didn't dare think too much about it, and put a black Go piece on the Go board hastily. Jing Jiao took a white Go piece and put it on the board. All the people on Shinma Peak, including Zhu Ruzhui, didn't know anything about zither, chess, calligraphy, or painting, so they couldn't understand the game. But they knew it must have a profound meaning. As such, they gathered around the table and watched the game intently with wide eyes. Fortunately, Jing Jiao put down the Go piece very quickly. Cain Yang understood what he meant and responded as quickly as she could. It didn't take long for the game to end. Cain Yang was under a great deal of pressure as her opponent was Jing Jiao. Her face was a bit pale, and her temples were wet with sweat. Zhu Ruzhui took out a handkerchief from his sleeve and handed it to her, asking, "Who won?" Cain Yang glanced at him gloomily, wondering who could win against her teacher. Lu Shisui and the others also glanced at Zhu Ruzhui, wondering if he was trying to find something to talk about. Zhao Liu thought the handkerchief was probably used to wipe the swallowing boat sword, but she didn't want to tell Cain Yang about it. The black and white Go pieces intertwined, looking rather complicated. Jing Jiao remained silent for a long time while looking at the Go board. It was quite normal for him to win, but the silence was abnormal. A fluttering sound broke out. The blue bird landed on the Go board, looking at Jing Jiao with fear in its eyes, but it was also full of courage. Jing Jiao lifted his head and touched its head with his finger, saying with pity, "Though you are the fastest, it's still too late." Chapter 7:15. The pity in Jing Jiao's eyes was a bit peculiar. It didn't seem to be a pity for the blue bird, but a sentiment for the human world. It was the same when he said it was too late. The blue bird strolled to the edge of the chessboard and looked at the outside of the cliff. thinking of Taiping Jinren, whom she had just left, and tens of thousands of years on the Cloud Dream Mountain. A complicated emotion showed in her eyes. She was fully aware that Jing Jiu wouldn't allow her to find Bai Jinren. It was because it was too dangerous. Even the pagoda of suppressing devils of the immortal Tan had been set up by the Bai family. Nobody could tell what tricks the Zhongzhou school had set up on the green sky mirror. Who should stop Bai Jinren then? Or like what Jing Jiu said, it was too late? Outside the cliff was the ocean of clouds, which looked even whiter under the starlight. There was a large patch of empty space on the other side of the ocean of clouds, which was where the Shangda Peak had been. Right now, it was a black ground. The cliff rocks were extremely dense, and the surface was very smooth. It looked like a huge black jade plate. Countless strands of cold intent seeped out from the black jade plate, turning the watery mist into tiny snowflakes and falling down. As a result, there were no clouds on the ground. The Queen of the Snowy Kingdom didn't swallow all the cold source at the bottom of the Shangda Peak, so a small part of it remained. The dead dog crouched quietly in the middle of the large black jade plate, looking like a black stone statue that was integrated with the ground. He exuded a sacred aura, and also a sense of solemn and respectful beauty. No disciple of Green Mountain dared stare directly at this principal guard, who was like a god and devil. The green girl's gaze was quite eye-catching. The dead dog turned his head toward the top of the Shinma Peak, expressing his intention with a calm and nonchalant expression in his eyes. Jing Jiu said, "You have to guard the sword jail here. You can't go out." The dead dog didn't feel displeased after being refused, but the expression in his eyes showed a hint of bewilderment. Ada scratched Jing Jiu with his paw, reminding him that he had said something wrong, wondering if Jing Jiu could speak properly. The Shanghai Peak was gone, and so was the sword jail. What was there left to guard? You have to defend Aoyama. Jing Jiu corrected himself. And it's really too late. What was it that was too late? Zhao Leiyu and Lu Shisui were not thinking about it. Qin Yang was still thinking about the game of Go, and Zhuo Ruzhui and Yuan Chu were more and more baffled. Even if Bai Jinren didn't die, what was there to be afraid of? Zhongzhou school would be in turmoil because of this, which was also the hardship of Zhongzhou school. What did it have to do with the Aoyama sect? Could it be that she dared to kill her way to their doorstep? Was she more powerful than the great Grandmaster Taiping and the fairy lady Bai Run? Jing Jiu ignored the confusion of his disciples and closed his eyes to rest on the bamboo chair. A splendid sword fire emerged from the cut on his earlobe, which looked like an earring made of precious stones, shining brightly under the starlight. The sword fire burned for a long time before it gradually disappeared, and the tiny wound stopped bleeding. By then, the morning sunlight had shone on the dilapidated peaks of Aoyama. Jing Jiu opened his eyes. He was not as tired as he had been the night before. Zhao Leiyu stared into his eyes and asked, "Are you really all right?" "Yes, I won't die." Jing Jiu reached out his hand and stroked her head. Then he leapt up into the air and left the top of Shinma Peak. The clouds and fog dispersed abruptly, revealing the true appearance of the Sword Peak. The collapsed cliffs looked like countless twisted and deformed roads, leaning against each other in a miserable manner. Jing Jiu landed in front of a cliff wall high above and saw countless flying swords and the young man and the swords. Standing in the midst of the flying swords, Ping Yongka looked pale and at a loss of what to do. Seeing Jing Jiu, he yelled joyfully, "Master! Master! You're finally here!" Jing Jiu waved his hand, and the flying swords returned to the cracks and piles of rocks on the cliffs with a dense sound of breaking through the air, continuing to receive the nourishment of the qi of heaven and earth. Ping Yongka ran over and said with a trace of lingering fear, "Yesterday, these swords went crazy and followed the white monster to the sky. After killing the fairy, they came back and trapped me. I don't know what they want to do." Jing Jiu looked at him in silence for a long time, and suddenly said, "I told them to do so." Ping Yongka was startled, but he didn't ask why his master wanted him to do so. He just answered honestly, "Oh." Jing Jiu suddenly reached out his hand and stroked his head, saying, "Do you know why I want you to be the master of the Sword Peak?" Feeling the palm on his head, Ping Yongka felt extremely happy. It should be noted that this was the privilege of Senior Master Ant and Big Brother Lou in the past. He answered subconsciously, "Isn't it because I'm talented enough to cultivate the shapeless sword body?" Jingjiu looked at him and asked with a faint smile, "When did you cultivate it?" Ping Yongka was speechless, thinking that he had been sleeping in the sword peak all these years, which couldn't be counted as cultivation. He said with some embarrassment, "But it can't be, because I'm cheap, can it? I'm not Big Brother Joie." Jingjiu didn't explain, but said instead, "There's something I want you to do, but I need to ask for your permission. You've always ordered us to do things. When have you ever been so polite?" Sensing his seriousness, Ping Yongka couldn't help but feel a great pressure, wondering what it was. Bai Zhenren rode the fire carp into the underworld. The fire carp had vaguely guessed what she intended to do. His spiritual soul trembled, not because of excitement, but because of fear. He had lived in the fire source at the bottom of the Gathered Soul Valley for tens of thousands of years, but he hadn't seen many human beings, so he didn't have much affection for them. Yet, he felt reluctant when he thought that someone like the eldest young Master Zhang might die. He summoned up his courage and advised her, "Immortal, what you're doing is against the natural order, and I'm afraid it's a hindrance to the path toward heaven. Besides, our Zhongzhou school is a famous sect and the leader of the orthodox sects. How can we do such a thing?" The fire carp opened and closed his mouth in the water of the underworld river, spitting out many bubbles with the peculiar glow of the soul fires. "I went to Zhaoga City with my mother more than 700 years ago. It was the first time I came out of the mountains, and I saw the scene where the king of the underworld was locked in the fiend prison." Bai Zhenren went on with a faint smile. "You, a stupid fish, have never seen the behavior of the orthodox sections. It was extremely chaotic in Chaotian at the time, and so was the cultivation circle, especially in Aoyama. Taiping Zhenren was the master of the Shangda Peak of the Aoyama sect in name, but he was actually marginalized. If he hadn't brought the new king of the underworld to the surface of the earth and made a great contribution to the human race, he would have been killed by those old weirdos on Machin Peak for some random reason. Yet, it was thought that he wouldn't be happy about it. It was because the king of the underworld was locked in the fiend prison, and he was forced to become a traitor who betrayed his friend. That was why he went to that restaurant to drink wine. That was why Lu Ci came all the way from Aoyama and poured wine for him while standing by his side. She and her mother stood on the South Heaven Gate at the time and looked at the scene in the restaurant from a distance, feeling that this pair of master and disciple were quite pitiful. It was then that Taiping Zhenren changed his mind. What about herself? When did she make up her mind? Thinking of the past events, Bai Zhenren asked while looking at the patch of blue in the distance, "Do you want to play this Go game with me?" The underworld master landed on the other side of the white pebble beach, his whole body exuding the smell of soul fires. It looked like he had exhausted a great deal of energy after traveling 1,000 miles. Looking at Bai Zhenren, he said with a baffled expression, "I don't understand why you did it." "It's because it's very interesting," said Bai Zhenren. The whole of Chaotian thought she was the most uninteresting person, but they didn't know that it was because she had never revealed her true intention. The underworld master said, "My teacher didn't succeed. How could you succeed?" Bai Zhenren said, "The game between Taiping and Jingyang looks like the latter will win all the games. But if I play the Go piece now, the final game will be in the middle. Jingyang doesn't even have a Go piece left. How can he defeat me?" Chapter 716. After leaving Tingguang Peak, Ah Piao came out of Aoyama under the starlight and got on the small green curtain sedan. Back when she and Ping Yongka lived in Zhaoga City for more than 10 years, Shuiyu Nunnery happened to be on duty at that time, so the chief nun was quite familiar with Ping Yongka. She carried Ping Yongka on her knees and arrived at the East Ocean in one night. The morning sunlight had just appeared, but the frost on the wild grass on the mountain was obviously not natural. Many of them were broken off, and the collapsed cliffs and dead people indicated how fierce the fighting had been the day before. Chief Nun, Shuiyu Nunnery, and the people of the Guochang Temple stood up in tandem, showing a surprised and delighted expression on their faces. The small green, curtained sedan landed at the foot of a cliff. A green light passed through the curtain and caressed Tong Yan's body like water, waking him up. Ah Piao exclaimed in surprise while looking at him. "You should be in the underground. Why are you here?" Tong Yin told her briefly about what had happened in the underworld, and said in the end, "The Broadsword King has entered the underworld, so he should be able to control the situation." What about the situation in Aoyama? Ah Piao had no time to recount the events that had happened in the Aoyama sect that day. She said while waving her hand, "My teacher said that your former master is in the underworld and asked you to arrange a plan to let Xiao Yuan kill her." The expression on Tong Yan's face changed slightly as he asked, "Why did my master go to the underworld?" Ah Piao retorted, "How would I know? My teacher always talks mysteriously and deliberately mystifies us. You should get down there as soon as possible." Tong Yin was extremely intelligent. She had vaguely guessed something from what Jing Jiao had told her. "It's impossible," she said with a pale face. She has always considered herself the leader of the orthodox cultivation sects. It's impossible for her to do such a thing. Ah Piao thought that Tong Yin and her teacher both liked to mystify others. "What is it?" she asked anxiously. Looking at the small green curtained sedan, Tong Yin said, "The Grand Priest is her person, and the Underworld Master will support her. She has the support of the whole Underworld, and the Broadsword King can't do anything to her." How can Jing Jiao not predict this? Shui Yu Nunnery's voice came from behind the green curtain. "If we can calculate where she will appear, we might have a chance." After a moment of silence, Tong Yin looked at the depths of the eastern sea illuminated by the morning light and said, "She should be there." The chief nun of the Water Moon Nunnery waved her hand, and a peach blossom appeared on the green curtain. An extremely elegant aura emanated from the petal and fell on the fu papers and the scripts carved by the previous masters on the cliff wall. The talisman paper and scripture suddenly shone brightly and actually covered up the morning light, like a huge spark. The spark lit up the entire East China Sea. Even people in Aoyama would be able to see it. Countless soldiers of the underworld, under the leadership of dozens of experts, risked their lives, waded through the underworld river, which still had a faint green smoke lingering on it, and rushed towards the cliff on the other side. It looked like an inexhaustible tide. The two sides, who had been fighting desperately and were like fire and water not long ago, suddenly became comrades who would go through life and death together. The situation had been reversed so quickly that those subordinates who were most loyal to the Underworld Master and the Grand Priest couldn't adapt to it. A large Buddha was sitting on the cliff, holding a huge iron broadsword in his hand, with faint green smoke exuding from his mouth and nostrils. He came to the underworld to save the lives, but he became the target of the other side. This was even more absurd than the alliance between the Underworld Master and the Grand Priest. He was the most powerful being in heaven and earth, save for the Queen of the Snowy Kingdom. The underground here naturally referred to the netherworld, be it the soul fires that could hurt one's Taoist heart or the arrows that were attached with the power of darkness. None of them could hurt him. However, there were just too many warriors and soldiers of the underworld. They were like a dense colony of ants, trying to drown the giant Buddha. Standing on a lonely mountain in the distance, the Underworld Master looked at the scene on the other side of the Underworld River. The glow on his face indicated that he had a complicated emotion at the moment, but he was more shocked than anything else. In one day and one night, he went to the heavenly realm of singing spring from the snowland, killed the Dark Phoenix, and returned to the seashore of the East Ocean to kill the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect. Normally, he should have consumed a great deal of his energy and been wounded severely, but it looks like we still can't defeat him even if we join hands. In the end, he will be cut in half by that iron broadsword. Standing on another lonely mountain, the Grand Priest said sentimentally, "Fortunately, we could defeat the entire underworld if we join hands. As for this person, we can only wait until the immortal has finished his business and then use the fairy book to suppress him." There was a line in the underworld river. The lotus flowers and the ashes of the corpses on the surface of the river separated, exposing the bright river water. Once in a while, a few soul fires would pop up from the surface of the river and look around curiously. The fire carp swam in the front of the line. He didn't stop until he came to a place where the raindrops were falling. There was no sunlight in the underworld, so the raindrops were scarce. The raindrops falling down from the sky were indeed strange. The fire carp flew up into the sky against the raindrops. The higher he flew, the denser the raindrops became. The fire carp was a creature born in the fire source of Chaotian. He had lived in the lava river since he was a child. He didn't like the underworld river, but he didn't like this kind of real and strange water. What puzzled him the most was that, according to little Zhang, the raindrops should be tasteless and clear like the vapor in the underground. But why was the raindrops here so salty? The fire carp smacked his lips and spat out the raindrops that had flowed into his mouth. His eyes were full of worry and anger, but he didn't dare to complain verbally. He continued to fly upward according to Bai Junren's will. After flying for a long time, he finally reached the highest point in the sky. There was a stretch of hard and dense black rocks. There were countless cracks in the rocks. From a distance, one would probably mistake it for a spider's web. Water kept flowing out from those cracks and fell into the sky of the underworld as rain. Bai Junren stood on the back of the fire carp and looked at the scenery in front of her. Her eyes revealed an expression of admiration. She waved her sleeves lightly, and the salty raindrops suddenly danced in the sky. One of the cracks flew to both sides, revealing a dark and gloomy interior. No one knew where it led to. The fire carp flew into the gloomy crack, suppressing the uneasiness and fear of the unknown. After flying for a long time, the view in front of him suddenly became bright and blue. Along with the blue sky came the booming sounds of thunder. It was the sound made by the endless seawater pouring down to the bottom of the ocean like a waterfall. The sky was blue, and so was the seawater. Countless lines formed by the drops of blood could be seen in the midst of the blue sky and ocean. The bloody lines exuded a dreadful, lethal energy, even as they were gradually dispersing. Bai Junren entered the underworld on the back of the fire carp and flew out from the huge whirlpool. This was the first time the fire carp had arrived on the ground of Chaotian. Looking around nervously, he found that he was surrounded by waterfalls formed by the seawater. The transparent walls of the seawater reminded him of his home, but the bloody lines made him feel uneasy, and he wanted to go home. Bai Junren arrived in the sky and reached out his finger to pick up a blood bead. He remained silent while sensing the spiritual soul of a devil coming from it. The fire carp wagged his tail slightly and asked in a trembling voice, "Immortal, am I going to die?" "Yes." Bai Junren flicked his finger lightly, and the blood bead broke into pieces. "Everything will be done tomorrow. I'll try to write a little more in the following month. I hope I can write 3,000 words per chapter. I'm in a hurry to write like this. I originally wanted to write about the fire carp king crying, and then it realized that its tears were also salty. But it's too easy to associate it with those non-mainstream words of love back then, so I deleted it. Chapter 717. The fire carp was in fact a carp, but it was called the fire carp because its body was red like a flame, and it lived in the fire source. It was indeed a divine animal. Otherwise, it wouldn't have lived for tens of thousands of years without reaching adulthood, which was why it called itself the king of fire carp. In fact, it was still a child. It looked timid and cowardly in the face of trouble. It wanted to bully the weak, but was often afraid of the strong. It looked innocent, but was talkative. This was all because it had lived underground for tens of thousands of years, but had not seen many people. It had not communicated with anyone, but that did not mean it was stupid. They were both divine animals born in response to the fire. Though it couldn't enlighten the saints and change heaven and earth like the vermilion bird, it was also extremely intelligent and could sense the heavenly secrets and dangers. It followed Bai Junren to the underworld and then traveled against the rain to the deep end of the ocean. Looking at the blood beads in the sky, it knew what awaited it. The blood beads formed a thread, the thread formed a net, and the net was the formation. This large formation was full of bloody and terrifying energy. The broken pieces of the corpses in the ocean water and the stench of the devil blood couldn't be blown away by the sea wind for a day and a night indicated that this was a powerful formation that required a blood sacrifice. The fire carp let out a gloomy sigh, thinking with a hint of self-pity and pride that there weren't many divine animals in Chaotian in a higher state and more honorable state than it, so its blood was the most suitable treasure to be used as a blood sacrifice. Thinking of this, all the self-pity and pride turned into fear and sadness. Was it going to die? It would be a long journey from the cold mountain to the secret realm of singing spring on the land of Chaotian, but the distance was shortened by traveling through the underworld. Faced with death, the fire carp had to think many times about how to get out of the predicament and even kill Bai Junren, no matter how short the distance was. The problem was that a great many years ago, the grandmasters of the previous generation of the Center Sect had employed a powerful magic to set up a powerful, forbidding formation in his body. The forbidding formation was distributed in every part of his body, like the sunlight cut open by the leaves or the wind combed by the willow branches. It was inseparable from his spiritual soul, not to mention launching a sneak attack on Bai Junren. Even if it wanted to leave, it would trigger a reaction from the restriction, and it would suffer a fate worse than death. There was no way they could continue fighting. Fortunately, the fire carp had an ultimate skill that they were very good at. It looked up to the sky and said, "Bai Yuan, my little friend, you see, I am much older than you, and my seniority is also much higher. Don't you think it's disrespectful to kill me like this?" Bai Junren stood in the sky a few miles above the giant whirlpool, his line of sight following a dark line in the ocean towards the northwest. The seawater there was obviously higher than elsewhere, like a mountain rising from the plains. It looked extremely magical, as if someone was doing something at the bottom of the sea. It was likely that the giant from the other continent had blocked the passage to the netherworld and was repairing the great maelstrom's passage to other places. The fire carp shouted with a trembling voice, "I'm a divine beast of the Cloud Dream Mountain after all. Though I haven't been to the Cloud Dream Mountain even once since I was born, it's because your ancestors said that there was no fire source on the mountain. It's not because I'm disloyal. I've been loyal to the Center Sect for tens of thousands of years. How could you sacrifice my blood to the formation?" Bai Junren pulled back his line of sight and looked at the fire carp sealed by the huge wall of seawater, saying, "The Center Sect has raised you for more than 20,000 years. It's time for you to do something for the Zhongzhou school." The fire carp waved his tail twice, exclaiming indignantly, "Who raised me? Who raised me? You're not my stepmother. I survived by myself in the fire source. When have you people ever cared about me? Coming to see me once in a few hundred years is considered raising me? I'm not familiar with you people at all. If I had known this earlier, I would have joined the Aoyama sect directly." Bai Junren reached out his finger and drew a circle in front of him. The blood bead that had scattered earlier had gradually condensed into a small blood-red pagoda, which looked similar to the pagoda of suppressing devils the immortal Tan had taken out in the Aoyama sect. Looking at the small blood-red pagoda, the fire carp sensed that the shadow of death was getting closer and closer, his voice trembling again. "Can we still negotiate?" Looking at the rising seawater in the huge whirlpool, Bai Junren remarked with an appreciative expression, "Using heaven and earth as the stove, the immortal's method is truly outstanding." The fire carp wondered if he should wave his fins and cheer when he was about to die. Bai Junren continued, "I'm not capable of such a method, but I can still add fuel to the fire. I'm a fish, not a piece of firewood," the fire carp murmured. Bai Junren said, "The underworld river is the fire, and the endless seawater is the firewood. I've led the fire source to the underworld, but I've merely poured a spoonful of oil on it. The firewood has to be added in the end. You've helped me reopen the passage leading to the underworld from the ocean, which will leave an important mark in the history of Chaotian. You'll die a worthy death." The fire carp was terrified, as he said, "Don't worry, immortal. The bird of the Aoyama sect is a divine animal, so its blood must be useful. Shall I go and pick it up for you?" Bai Junren said, "Even though the Dark Phoenix is the leader of the formation, he will die for sure after being attacked by Chao Yuan and the giant. The fire carp yelled anxiously. Even if he's dead, his blood won't be drained. Immortal, let me pick up the corpse. Bai Jinren closed his eyes and started tempering the small, blood-red pagoda, paying no more attention to the fire carp. What if you let me go first? I'll pretend to join the Aoyama sect and become a spy there, killing that old tortoise in secret. I'll drain his blood. I've heard from Tong, Yin, that the old tortoise is older than me, so his blood must be more fragrant than mine. Can't you do that? Immortal, I'm still young, so the effect of my blood isn't that good. If you wait for a few more days, I'll be an adult soon. It's true. I didn't lie to you. In a few days, when I become an adult, this disgusting, handsome formation will become stronger. By then, you will be able to kill all the people of the Green Mountain sect, even if the large Buddha under the ground floats up, and even if that unbelievably powerful monster at the bottom of the ocean comes, to say nothing of opening the passage to the underworld. Immortal, even if you want me to die, you can't do it here. I don't like the seawater. I'll sink to the bottom of the ocean after I die. Do you want me to become a salted fish? No matter how he tried to persuade the fire carp, he tried to persuade the fire carp with his emotions, or he tried to be unreasonable and shameless. It was useless. The fire carp stopped talking, looking at the increasingly deep, bloody lines in the sky. A hopeless expression showed in his eyes. He decided to fight with his life on the line. As soon as the thought was born, he let out a blood-curdling scream and began to roll around in pain in the mist created by the waterfall. Several extremely deep lines of blood appeared on its body. Its incomparably hard scales were cut open, emitting popping sounds, as if the strings of a zither had been snapped. Blood gushed out from the wounds and began to burn when it came into contact with the sea breeze. Even when the blood fell into the seawater, the flames did not extinguish. The fire carp's screams and cries of pain could be heard from the flames, just like a child. Bai Jinren opened his eyes and pointed his right hand at the ball of flames. His expression was extremely calm. Crack! Amidst the horrifying sounds of cutting, the fire carp was broken into countless pieces and fell into the sea, splashing some waves before vanishing. From tomorrow to the 20th of October, an average of 3,000 per day. Chapter 718. The blood of the fire carp dropped onto the surface of the ocean like the raindrops, burning up with a boom. The saying, "the rain in spring is like oil," was true. As Bai Jinren moved his fingers slightly, the golden flame containing the energy of the divine animals drifted away from the surface of the ocean and into the blood beads in the sky. The blood beads emitted a bright glow, and the lethal energy grew stronger. A tender cry could be heard coming out from the blood beads. It was unclear whether it was the cry of a ghost or something else. The Dark Phoenix was killed by Chao Yuan, and those demons were knocked unconscious by the giant and sent to the far end of the ocean. The heavenly slaying formation had lost its main operator and had not been replenished by the blood sacrifice. It had become much weaker after one day and one night, and it was on the verge of dissipating in the sea wind. However, after receiving the true blood of the fire carp, the formation grew stronger instead of weakening. The mountain-like patch of ocean water in the distance suddenly dispersed, and the black line at the bottom of the ocean grew thicker. Bai Jinren knew that the giant had sensed the change of the heavenly slaying formation and was about to come back. Bai Jinren raised his right hand calmly and reached toward the sky. The tender cry came out from the blood beads, filling the sky again. As soon as the cry vanished, thousands of blood beads fell down like raindrops and arrived above Bai Jinren's head along with the sea wind, forming a blood bead full of bloody smell and lethal energy. Bai Jinren raised it on her palm. The expression in her eyes was still nonchalant, but a layer of eerie blood appeared in the deep end of her eyes. The fire carp was a true divine animal of ancient times, and she had the pagoda of suppressing devils as the center of the formation. The heavenly slaying formation, which the bloody demon church couldn't set up even after sacrificing countless lives, had finally displayed its full power in her hands. It was even more powerful than the formation set up by Taiping Jinren. Even though she was an unparalleled swordsman in the Dachan state and one step away from ascension, she still couldn't withstand it. She had been prepared for it. An exceedingly pleasant and tranquil fairy voice suddenly burst out in the distant sky. Countless golden lights shot out from her palm, evaporating the blood beads full of bloody smell and lethal energy. It was a fairy card. The demon blood with lethal energy didn't disappear entirely. It entered the fairy card. The golden immortal that was supposed to be incomparably pure and brimming with immortal intent was now stained with a layer of blood. It looked even more filthy than the heavenly killing formation in the sky. Bai Junren clenched his fist and punched into the great maelstrom. Back when Jing Jiu participated in the Dao competition of Zhongzhou School, he won the tripod in the green sky mirror and obtained a fairy card. He had punched the fairy card while holding it. Bai Qianjun, who ambushed him, had won his arms crippled. If not for Bai Junren's help, he would have died on the spot. Bai Junren's cultivation state was much higher than that of Jing Jiu's. What kind of power would it have if he combined the heavenly slaying formation and the full power of the immortals? The passage leading to the underworld had been blocked by the giants, but the passage leading to the alien land hadn't been built yet. The huge maelstrom was full of seawater at the moment. The seawater poured into the huge maelstrom, making booming sounds. Countless bubbles appeared on the surface of the ocean, and a few drops of blood could be seen occasionally. A flash of golden light and a fist wind that could shake the clouds landed on the surface of the ocean and dispersed into a single point. The surface of the ocean in the huge maelstrom suddenly became tranquil, devoid of any wind. Then it broke apart. The bubbles broke apart first, and then the seawater around that point. A straight black line appeared in the white turbulence. The black line passed through the endless seawater at an unimaginable speed and reached the bottom of the ocean. Then it melted through the hard rocks and pierced through those cracks, arriving at the abyss in the end. The moment the black line arrived at the empty space, a large amount of fairy energy and lethal energy spread out in front of the black line. Boom! It was as if the thunder of the heavenly punishment had arrived in the human world, suppressing the sound of the falling water easily. The surface of the ocean suddenly sank a distance of 100 feet. The hard bottom of the ocean was shaken up, and the cracks that were already there like cobwebs expanded rapidly and began to collapse into the abyss. In a few seconds, a large hole with a radius of more than 10 miles appeared at the bottom of the huge maelstrom. Endless seawater poured into the big hole, bringing up countless waves. Because the speed of the falling was too fast, even the huge maelstrom couldn't be formed. The secret realm of singing spring disappeared just like that. The sea entered the underworld again. This time, it was even more turbulent, surging, and violent. With the power of heaven and earth, who could stop it? The entire underworld heard the loud noise in the sky. Endless seawater fell from a very high place, looking like hundreds of ferocious blue dragons that wanted to devour all the lives in the lower world. The soldiers of the underworld who were attacking the giant Buddha noticed this strange phenomenon in the sky. They put down the weapons in their hands in horror, not knowing what to do. It wouldn't take long for the seawater to fall to the ground. Like countless stones, it would crush countless people of the underworld, and the great flood that followed would kill even more people. The more dreadful thing was that when the sea met the underworld river, a great deal of green smoke would rise up again, and the people in the underworld and the human world would be plunged into misery and suffering. Looking at the countless seawater falling down from the sky and the white figure arriving with the seawater, Chao Yuan displayed a furious expression on his mottled face. The formidable broadsword will rose up, breaking open the cliff and destroying the colorless tree, heading toward the patch of seawater. Looking at the cold broadsword light rising from the ground, Bai Junren opened his right hand expressionlessly. Crack! A few unpleasant sounds rang out in heaven and earth. The broadsword light vanished on the cliff by the underworld river. The fairy energy from the upper world vanished on the blood-stained yellow fairy sword. A few cracks appeared on the iron broadsword that had been traveling in heaven and earth. Chao Yuan stood up. He intended to slash by Junrin with his broadsword, even if his golden body was destroyed. Hundreds of white lotus flowers suddenly appeared in the dark night sky. Like the black and white colors of the underworld, they formed a stable barrier that blocked all of his broadsword wills and lethal wills. The underworld master and the grand priest appeared on the other side of the underworld river. They paid no attention to their subordinates who were fleeing in all directions and focused on the large Buddha statue on the mountain. Master Broadsword King, please enlighten me. Baijinren landed on the underworld river. She pushed on a lotus flower with the tip of her foot and leaped forward a few miles in an instant. Hundreds of white lotus flowers swam over from both sides of the underworld river along with her energy, forming a flawless white lotus boat. She stood on the lotus boat with her hands folded behind her back. The lotus boat drifted along the underworld river. She knew that the lotus boat was a boat used by the underworld to ferry the souls of the dead, but she didn't care whether it was auspicious or not. She regarded it as a funeral for the human world. The underworld master was the student of Taiping Jinren and the strongest swordsman in the underworld. If he hadn't been sneak attacked by Tong Yin with the Sina Cloud Bell, his cultivation state would be similar to Lu Si's. Even though the Grand Priest was a bit weaker, he was still an important figure who could summon wind and rain. Even if they couldn't kill Chao Yuan together, they could at least keep him in that patch of mountain. Who could stop her then? The lotus boat traveled along the river. It was unclear where it was headed. A gentle wind was blowing in the dim underworld, but it wasn't the wind that came from the large hole in the sky. It came from somewhere else. The wisps of wind seemed to be gentle, but they contained the upstanding will. The lotus boat left the surface of the river and headed toward the sky against the direction of the wind. Yamatai was on the other side of the wind. A great amount of seawater was still in the sky, waiting to bring a catastrophe to the underworld. But the booming sounds of breaking the air had already broken out, sounding like the muffled thunder on both sides of the underworld river. The inhabitants of the underworld walked out of their houses and looked up at the sky, a hopeless expression showing on their faces. Something like this had already happened the day before. The sky had been broken. Fortunately, it had been repaired by an immortal in the upper world. There was such a large hole in the sky that day, which could be seen clearly from the ground. Who could repair it? The morning sunlight grew brighter, and the morning sun rose. The huge waves formed on the surface of the ocean. The giant returned to the bank of the huge whirlpool. His mountain-like body was covered with sand and wounds, his eyes full of bewilderment. He spent the whole night repairing the passage leading from the huge whirlpool to the distant place. Unexpectedly, he found that the huge whirlpool had become a hole when he came back. The seawater was pouring down at an unimaginable speed. The dark and gloomy bottom of the hole looked even more dreadful due to the blue color of the seawater, which looked like the eye of the giant. He shook his head reflexively in an attempt to drive this description or analogy out of his mind. The bewilderment on his face gradually turned into frustration and helplessness. He reached out his hand to rub his head, almost knocking a flock of birds off the cloud. He thought that he couldn't block the hole even if he were to lie down in it. What should he do? The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he felt. He felt guilty and even sad. It was then that he suddenly sensed a similar emotion among the beads of blood filling the sky. He couldn't help but feel sadder, wondering who had died here. The eldest young Master Zhang in the Green Sky Mirror had become the Grandmaster Zhang a long time ago. No matter how stubborn a person was, he would inevitably become a bit muddle-headed as he grew older, and the Grandmaster Zhang was no exception. Of course, his stubborn temperament hadn't changed much. 2 days ago, he suddenly asked his youngest son, who was the current head of the Zhang clan, to renovate the ancestral hall and light a thick incense stick. And he warned his family members sternly that this thick incense stick shouldn't be extinguished. Otherwise, he would beat them up or even kill them. The Grandmaster Zhang was still the Grandmaster Zhang, and nobody dared disobey his order. Moreover, it was nothing more than building an ancestral hall and lighting a thick incense stick. It was nothing serious. What the whole Zhang clan was worried about the most was that the Grandmaster Zhang often went out for a stroll. What if an accident happened? Don't stop me. The Grandmaster Zhang cursed angrily while looking at his descendants in the courtyard, while leaning on the walking stick. I'm not muddle-headed. None of you can talk to me. I can only talk to the sky, which makes me look like an idiot. Having said that, he was still angry. He raised the walking stick and swung it at his youngest son's back. The head of the Zhang clan didn't dare dodge it. As he was about to take the hit, he was pulled to the side by his youngest daughter. The little girl came forward to support the Grandmaster Zhang. "Grandpa, where do you want to go?" she asked in a soft voice. The Grandmaster Zhang said angrily, "I want to go to the front yard to look at the wells." Hearing this, the people in the courtyard displayed a helpless expression, but they also found it funny. The little girl said with a bitter smile, "There are so many wells in the house. Which one do you want to look at? Do you want to look at the octagonal well, the Yongquan well, or the Sioux well dug last year?" Chapter 719. There was no doubt that the Zhang family was second to none in the old Chu state. Its power and status were almost equal to that of the Grand Secretary Zhang when he was in power. Of course, this was due to the longevity of the old Master Zhang. However, only the members of the Zhang family knew that the old master was a difficult master to serve because of his many eccentricities. Not only did he talk to the sky, but he also had a hobby of digging wells. After moving back to the old capital from the south, the first thing he did was to dig several wells in his house. As the Zhang family expanded, more and more wells were dug in the courtyard. Walking through the cloister, around the screen wall, in front of the flowers and under the trees, there were dark wells everywhere. Naturally, it was not safe. Moreover, the old master, who liked to look at wells, was getting weaker and weaker. What if he slipped? Therefore, in the past 2 years, the Zhang family had sealed most of the wells with iron bars. "It's all sealed. What's the point of looking at it? Get up." The old Master Zhang waved his walking stick and shouted with a red face. Holding his arm, the granddaughter looked at her grandfather's gray hair and felt sad. She winked at her father. The head of the Zhang family sighed helplessly. He waved his hand to ask the steward to open the iron bars of the wells. Then he stepped forward and held his father's other arm. Surrounded by dozens of respected masters, madams, young masters, and young ladies of the Zhang family, the old Master Zhang began to look at the wells. When he came to the well named Gushing Spring, he held the wall and looked at the bottom of the well in silence for a long time. His family members looked at him worriedly, afraid that something might happen. "This well is most similar to the well in the south," the old Master Zhang murmured. In fact, the Zhang family had never understood why this well was called Gushing Spring. It should be noted that the water in the capital was not abundant. They had to dig very deep to find water. How could there be a gushing spring? You don't know how talkative that guy was, more talkative than me. He kept spitting water. Tut tut. A smile appeared on the wrinkled face of the old Master Zhang as he thought of some interesting memories. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from his face. His body trembled, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood fell on the wall of the well and slowly dripped down. Cries of alarm rang out in the courtyard. Everyone rushed forward, wanted to help him leave. But the Grandmaster Zhang's hands were as hard as iron. He grabbed the edge of the well and stared at the gloomy bottom of the well, his pale face full of sadness and anger, yelling, "Your Majesty, kill her!" Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. Could it be that the old master had reached his final moments? Otherwise, why would he be so muddle-headed? Everyone knew that he was referring to the last emperor of the Chu kingdom. That emperor had perished together with the brutal Qin emperor many years ago. What did you call him for? Flutter, flutter. A blue bird ignored the hostility of those iron eagles, landed on the top of Yunqing Peak, and transformed into a human being. Qing looked at Jing Jiao and Ping Yongka, who were staring at each other speechlessly. She said uneasily, "Something must have happened, though I don't know how he found out." A blood-red sword light illuminated the thick clouds and fog. Zhao Liu had come from the Shima Peak. It was obvious that she was worried about Jing Jiao's situation. Ping Yongka was still shocked by Jing Jiao's request as he asked, "Master, What on earth do you want me to do? Hearing this, Qing, and Zhao Liu had vaguely guessed what Jing Jiao was going to do. Qing, guessed it because she and Ping Yongka were the same kind, and Zhao Liu guessed it because she knew too many of Jing Jiao's secrets. It was evident that Jing Jiao's request to Ping Yongka was the same as Lu Ci's request to Jing Jiao during the Battle of the West Ocean. Now that the scabbard of the inherited Heaven Sword had been destroyed, only Ping Yongka could command the swords of Aoyama. If Jing Jiao wanted to use the sword formation of Aoyama to kill Bai Jinren, he had to have Ping Yongka in his hands. The problem was that if he did that, Ping Yongka's life would be in Jing Jiao's hands, and Ping Yongka would no longer be able to go against his will. Clouds and mist lingered around the mountain peak, naturally bringing a long sword intent. It gave off an awe-inspiring feeling, making people feel somewhat uncomfortable. Zhao Liu glanced at Jing Jiao and said to Ping Yongka, "The sect master wants to borrow a sword." "Borrow a sword? I don't have a sword," Ping Yongka said in confusion. Suddenly, he understood everything. He was like the fire carp, but he was naive, not really stupid. So many things that happened in the past were still vivid in his mind, but he had never thought about it until Zhao Liu asked him to borrow a sword. It was true that he didn't have a sword. He had learned the shapeless sword body after sleeping on the sword peak for a few years. When he was in Zhaoga City, the rain of swords didn't hurt him at all. For instance, Jing Jiao had asked him if he knew why Jing Jiao wanted him to be the peak master of the sword peak. "So, I'm also a sword?" Ping Yongka said this while pointing at himself. He felt quite happy after the initial shock and uneasiness had disappeared. If he had known that he was a sword instead of a human being when he first entered Aoyama, he would have cried every night and felt so much pain that he didn't want to live. He might have even reported it to his masters and asked if he would be locked up in the sword jail to be with those demons and devils. But now, his master was a sword, so what if he was a sword? His master wanted to borrow his sword. He had already sensed that the sheath of the inherited Heaven Sword had been destroyed, and he knew that it was something his master was afraid of the most. That was why his master said it so solemnly. The expression in Ping Yongka's eyes grew determined. He forced out all the sword wills in his body, just like what he had done in Zhaoga City, and then reached out his hand to Jing Jiao. The formidable sword wills left his clothes and body and turned into sword lights, illuminating the gloomy cliff. Seeing this, the expression in Qing Er's eyes was a bit different, and Zhao Liu admired him a bit. She would agree to Jing Jiao's request if she were Jing Jiao, but it was different. Looking at the sword lights coming out from Ping Yongka's body, Jing Jiao suddenly laughed out. It was a rare thing for him to do. Zhao Liu suddenly felt uneasy. Jing Jiao said, "I don't want to borrow your sword. I just want to ask you a favor." Ping Yongka asked in surprise. "What is it?" "Don't kill me," said Jing Jiao while looking at Jing Jiao. It grew quieter on the peak of the mountain, even a bit deathly still. The dreadful cries of the iron eagles could be heard outside the clouds and fog. Jing Jiao continued, "Even if I want to kill you, don't kill me." Ping Yongka opened his mouth wide, not knowing what his master was talking about. "If I become someone like my big brother in the future and want to destroy this world, or destroy your lover, whom you value more than the world, don't kill me," Jing Jiao said in the end. "All in all, no matter what happens, you can't kill me, and you can't restrict my freedom." Qing and Zhao Liu understood what he meant, their expressions changing slightly. Ping Yongka had finally understood what Jing Jiao meant. With an incredulous expression on his face, he waved his hands like a crazy person, yelling, "How can I do this? It's a rebellion. One can't lift himself up," said Jing Jiao. Zhao Liu suddenly interrupted him, saying, "You can." Jing Jiao shot a glance at her and said, "That's flying. It's two different things." Then he continued, "I can be a sword, but I can't be the one wielding the sword at the same time." It was true that he could be a sword, a most powerful sword since the beginning of heaven and earth. That sword had killed the great Grand Master of the Foggy Island, Nan Shu, in the sky over the West Ocean, split the scorching sun gorge, and destroyed the mountain gate of the mysterious dark sect, illuminated the muddy river one night, and killed countless demons. Who was qualified to use this sword? Lu Xi was dead, and so was Taiping Jinren. The queen of the Snowy Kingdom had learned the inherited heaven sword style, but Jingjiu had predicted that she would be sent to the outside world. More importantly, the inherited heaven sword was destroyed. Nobody in this world could use this sword anymore. As such, Jingjiu came to the sword peak and stood in front of Ping Yongka. "No," said Zhao Liu. "Since you have guessed his origin, you should know that he should be able to do it." Jingjiu went on. "Everybody thinks that I have destroyed the sword formation of Aoyama. But in fact, the sword formation of Aoyama can be rebuilt as long as he is here." Zhao Liu demanded while staring into his eyes. "If so, why don't you join hands with him to rebuild the sword formation of Aoyama and then go to kill Bai Jinren?" Jingjiu said, "It's too slow to rebuild the sword formation of Aoyama, and so is the sword formation itself. If it was too slow, it would be too late, just like what he'd said before." Zhao Liu called out the thoughtless sword and said, "You can use it to build another sword formation of slaying fairies with the lone sword and the sword of the universe." The thoughtless sword was the fastest among the swords in Aoyama, and even among the swords in the world. "You know that this sword isn't as fast as me," said Jingjiu calmly. Looking at the sky beyond the clouds, Zhao Liu showed a stubborn expression on her face, her short hair ruffled by the mountain wind. "I still don't agree. He can be trusted." "No, I don't even trust myself on this matter. Not even Lu Shui. Not even anybody." Zhao Liu pulled back her gaze and said to Jingjiu seriously, "Your life must be in your own hands." "You shouldn't be such a person," said Qing who had been silent all this while. "What kind of person should I be?" asked Jingjiu. Qing said without hesitation, "You are a person who is afraid of death." It was well known in the world that both the immortal Jingyang and the current Jingjiu were very lazy and afraid of trouble, and their biggest characteristic was their fear of death. All he wanted to do was to stay behind closed doors in Aoyama and ignore the affairs of the mortal world. He had never risked his life for Lin Sanyue in this life. Even though the cultivation circle had experienced an unprecedented event in 1,000 years yesterday, the return of Taiping Jinren and the arrival of the fairy lady from the sky, he still didn't want to step into a dangerous place. Back when Lu Xi wanted to use his sword, he had never agreed to it. It wasn't until he was severely wounded by Nanchu in the temple that he finally agreed to Lu Xi's request. In order to eliminate the hidden danger, he had destroyed the inherited heaven sword at all costs. As a result, he voluntarily handed over the control of his own life to Ping Yongka. Was it because Bai Jinren wanted to destroy the world? Zhao Liu couldn't figure it out, and neither could Qing. Jingjiu said, "I'll tell Bai Yuan the reason when I see her." "What do you want to do?" demanded Zhao Liu angrily. "I'll do whatever I want to do," said Jingjiu. This was a brilliant answer. After a moment of silence, Zhao Liu asked, "What do you want to do now?" Jingjiu said with a smile, "I want to summon the wind and rain and travel 10,000 miles." By now, Zhao Liu realized that Jingjiu had overheard the conversation between her and Taiping Jinren a few days ago. Qing murmured, "He is neither Taiping nor Lu Xi. You won't be able to hold on for too long." Like Jingjiu, she was a true spirit of the heavenly state that was born to contain the world, so her judgment was the most accurate. Zhao Liu asked while staring into Jingjiu's eyes, "Are you sure you'll be all right?" This was the third time she asked. Jingjiu said while rubbing her head, "Don't worry, I won't die." Having said that, Jingjiu reached out his hand to Qing saying, "Give me the green sky mirror." Qing didn't mock and ridicule him like she had done in the past. She reached out her small hand and patted on his palm, making a faint paw sound. Ping Yongka had finally come back to his senses from the initial shock. "Master, it's too dangerous," he said in a sobbing tone. "What if I become a villain in the future?" Jingjiu had talked so much with Jingjiu that day, so he had run out of patience. He furrowed his eyebrows slightly. After all, he was not Zhao Liu. Ping Yongka didn't dare delay any longer, though his face was pale. He reached out his trembling hand and pointed at Jing Jiao. The soles of Jing Jiao's feet left the ground and drifted in the air. He looked very light, like a gust of gentle wind. Back in the fiend prison, he had drifted in front of the king of the underworld once after he had mastered the underworld fairy sword. Later, he had drifted in front of Nan Chu on the ruins of the small temple in the deep mountain. The sword lights were drifting among the cliffs, hovering around Jing Jiao. The sword wills were interlinked, and their minds were interlinked. Ping Yongka suddenly found that he could know all the thoughts of his master. He couldn't help but feel excited, his fingers trembling even more violently. In the next moment, he pointed his right hand toward the distant East Ocean. Boom! Jing Jiao disappeared from the original spot. A strong wind whipped up among the cliffs. Zhao Leiyu and the other two looked toward the east. Liangwang Peak was located to the east of the Sword Peak. A band of smoke and dust rose up on Liangwang Peak, looking like a blooming flower. As the smoke and dust dispersed, a hole could be vaguely seen in the cliff. The morning sunlight shone through the hole, looking as straight as a sword. A flash of sword light could be vaguely seen in the distant sky, heading toward the east at an unimaginable speed. Soon, it disappeared in the morning sunlight. How could there be such a fast sword in the world? The flash of sword light illuminated the peaks of Aoyama, startling many people. Nan Wang sat on the black rock on the top of Qingrong Peak, his bare feet stepping on the flowering trees. He held an alcohol jar in his hand, a nonchalant expression on his face. It was unclear what was on his mind. Guang Yuanjinren was sweeping the fallen leaves on the stone beam between Shuriwe Peak and Shilai Peak. Sensing the change of energy on the Sword Peak, he lifted his head to look at the sky and exclaimed in admiration. The dead dog stood up slowly and looked at the flash of sword light on the horizon with a warm expression in his eyes. It seemed that he was quite satisfied. The disciples of the peaks walked out of their manor caves in tandem, seeing the sword light off in the morning sunlight. Ada walked to the edge of the cliff and squatted down. The bloodstains on his body glowed faintly in the morning sunlight, giving off a sacred feeling. The ocean of clouds at the foot of the cliff on Shinma Peak was a bit chaotic, just like Ada's mood at the moment. What's wrong with you? Looking at the distant sword light, Yuan Shu murmured, if the sect master doesn't come back, then... Lu Shui said calmly. Pooh, pooh. Zhuoruzhui spat on the ground a few times. I made a mistake about the number of chapters yesterday, but it's not important. Chapter 720. The violent wind was still blowing over the Sword Peak. The iron eagles were startled and flew to a farther place, but they didn't disperse the thick clouds and fog. Ping Yongka sat on the ground with his eyes closed, breathing calmly and peacefully. It seemed that he had fallen asleep, but his right hand was still pointing to the east, as if he was telling the world how bright the sun was. The sounds of friction and the rolling sand and stones could be heard everywhere on the cliffs. Countless swords flew out again and hovered in the surrounding sky, as if they were setting up a formation. Zhao Leiyu was fully aware that this was not the sword formation of Aoyama reappearing in the human world. It was merely a prototype. Qinger said while looking at her, given his temperament, it seems that you are indeed special to him, since he explained patiently to you for such a long time at such a critical moment. Zhao Leiyu didn't say anything. She looked at the sword hole on the cliff wall of Liangwang Peak in silence, feeling a bit absent-minded. The violent wind had died down, and the Sword Peak was illuminated by a few sword lights. Nan Wang, Guang Yuanjinren, and the three elders from the Hermit Peaks landed in the middle of the mountain. They didn't say anything, and they didn't even come close to the place where Ping Yongka was sitting. They chose a cliff and sat down respectively, indicating that they were guarding him. A thin thread came out from the clouds and fog, which gradually weaved into something like a snowball and fell accurately into Zhao Leiyu's bosom. Zhao Leiyu rubbed his head gently. Ada rubbed against her head to comfort her, telling her that it would be difficult for that guy to die, even if he wanted to. The violent wind suddenly kicked up again, and the clouds and fog were swept up into the sky. The dead dog appeared above the ocean of clouds, looking down at the human world with an extremely cold expression in his eyes. There was a long distance between Aoyama and the East Ocean. Even the fastest sword, the thoughtless sword, couldn't arrive there quickly. Yet this sword light was special that day. Soon after the cliff wall of Liangwang Peak was pierced through, the sword light illuminated the cliff wall by the East Ocean and the gloomy heavenly well. The sword light landed among the frosty grass, and Jingzhou's cloth was ruffling slightly. Apia was very surprised. She thought to herself, "Sir, you told me to come here. Why did you chase after me? Could it be that you have something else to tell me? Where's Chao Yuan?" Jingzhou asked with furrowed eyebrows. Since he had made such an important decision and paid such a huge price, he wanted to take full control of the situation. He did not like this kind of accident to happen. "The Sword Saint has entered the underworld," Tong Yin said. Jingzhou looked at him and asked, "You didn't succeed?" Tong Yin said, "The underworld master's cultivation state is too high." Jingzhou didn't have time to listen to his explanation. He reached out his hand and said, "Give me the clock." The scenic cloud bell was the magic treasure carried by the immortal Tan. The reason it appeared in Tong Yan's hands was because Jingzhou and the immortal Tan had reached an agreement. Tong Yin was silent for a while. Then she took out the scenic cloud bell and put it in his hand. Looking at this scene, Apiao felt that it was a little inauspicious, but she didn't dare to say anything. Looking at the small green curtained sedan, Jingzhou said, "Young sister, please guard this place for a while." It was unclear when he started treating the people of Shui Yu Nunnery very politely. The nonchalant voice of Master Shui Yu Nunnery came out from the small green curtained sedan. "You go ahead." Whoosh! Jingzhou disappeared from the original spot. The sword light went to the East Ocean. The frosty grass snapped again as the ocean wind blew over. The small green curtained sedan drifted up and hovered over the heavenly well. Countless tiny peach blossoms bloomed on the green curtain, exuding a fresh and clean energy, sealing off the passage like the silk threads. Countless huge waves appeared in the deep part of the ocean, as if they had turned into a river, rushing toward a certain place. The endless seawater was flowing toward the huge whirlpool. Along with the deafening sound, the blue and transparent water wall kept collapsing, falling into the endless abyss. The blue seawater was illuminated by a bright sword light. The giant rubbed his eyes subconsciously. When he saw Jingzhou looming in the waves, he couldn't help but open his mouth wide, an incredulous expression on his simple and honest face. He wondered how Jingzhou could come here so fast, and more importantly, how did he come here? He hadn't seen Jingzhou for hundreds of years, but he would never forget what kind of person his friend was. Looking at the countless drops of blood in the sky, Jingzhou couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly as he sensed the ferocious energy in them. The number of times he raised his eyebrows this morning was more than the number of times he had raised his eyebrows in his entire life. The heavenly slaying formation was indeed extremely powerful and dreadful, especially after sacrificing the blood of the fire carp. It had the power to destroy heaven and earth, but it still couldn't stop the all-in-one sword. The sword light illuminated the surface of the ocean. Together with the last ray of morning sunlight, it passed through countless sprays and tore apart the heavenly slaying formation as if it were a piece of paper, arriving at the center of the huge whirlpool. Standing amid the watery mist in the sky, Jingzhou took a look at the seawater pouring down to the underworld. He raised his eyebrows again and took out the green sky mirror with a flip of his right hand. The rising sun was even brighter than before. The sunlight reflected off the green sky mirror and formed a bright beam of light. There were many complicated patterns around the beam of light. If one looked closely, they would find that the so-called patterns were actually made up of tiny amulets and scripts. If Zen Master were here, he would find that Jingzhou employed the method of Zen mirror that he was most proficient in, and it also contained the energy of the method of splitting mirrors of the mirror sect, which was in a more advanced state. The beam of light emitted by the green sky mirror shone into the deep end of the heavenly slaying formation along with the flowing amulets and scripts. The drops of blood containing the bloody energy of the demons melted abruptly when they encountered the beam of light. In the deep end of the heavenly slaying formation, a gloomy flame drifted erratically. It was suddenly shone on by the beam of light, unable to move. A moment later, the gloomy flame returned along the beam of light, and Jingjiu drew it back into the green sky mirror. The world in the green sky mirror was the same as usual. Not a single heavenly fire appeared. The streets were crowded with tourists, and the sounds of sticks were as loud as thunder in the yamen. The robbers were looking at the distant mountains with the traces of tears on their faces. There was an uproar in the Zhang manor, followed by a loud cry. A few madams peeked in the direction of the gushing spring, while crying, wondering if the Grandmaster of the Zhang clan was going to die if he spat out blood. How could the water in the well be used now that there was blood in it? The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan's energy was very weak, but his hands were still clinging to the edge of the well, unwilling to be helped away. He stared into the well. The blood he spat out flowed down along the wall of the well. Soon, it couldn't be seen anymore, but he was aware that the blood had already melted into the water of the well. The blood drifted away in the clear water of the well, and then condensed into a lump. Then, some protrusions appeared on the surface of the blood. One of the protrusions quivered slightly, and some fine lines appeared on the surface of the protrusions, which looked like the fins of a fish. As time went by, the shape of the blood became clearer, and it turned into a red carp. The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan's feeble body had somehow obtained a powerful strength. He straightened his body abruptly and yelled sternly, "Scoop this fish up!" The red carp was scooped up and then placed into a golden basin gingerly. The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan entered the ancestral hall with the golden basin in his hands and closed the door behind him, forbidding anyone from peeping inside, including his favorite granddaughter. The periphery of the ancestral hall was crowded. The descendants of the Zhang clan looked at the tightly shut wooden door of the ancestral hall with a grave expression, wondering what had happened. The few madams who were worried that the water in the well could not be used gathered in a corner and talked in a low voice. They could vaguely hear the words evil and ominous in their words. The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan was exhausted after all this. Sitting on the ground in front of the incense burner table, he looked at the red carp in the golden basin with a nervous expression on his face. The red carp was listless, its body swaying from side to side from time to time, and its mouth was foaming as if it would die at any moment. "Old buddy, is that you?" the Grandmaster of the Zhang clan asked in a trembling voice. "Who else could it be if not me?" The red carp said weakly. "Are you going to wash your hands with my bathwater? Why are you so frugal?" The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan asked blankly. "What do you mean?" The red carp's voice was full of annoyance and helplessness. Even if it were a real treasure basin, it would still be too small, let alone a golden basin. Its feeble tail suddenly touched the wall of the basin, and the fish's lips suddenly became round, squeezing out a scream. "Mother Aster's it hurts. Give me a bigger place, quick." The Grandmaster of the Zhang clan hurriedly stood up and pushed open the door of the ancestral hall, yelling loudly, "Get the big tub I use for bathing here, and you dig a pond in the yard." The people had all heard the cries of pain from the carp, and their faces turned pale with fear. Hearing the Grandmaster's order, they didn't dare to stay any longer and took the opportunity to run out. The door of the ancestral hall was open. The golden basin was on the ground, and the incense burner table was on the top. "Aya!" The giant's voice came from outside the heavenly slaying formation, sounding like muffled thunder. Jingjiu knew that the giant was reminding him that the heavenly slaying formation covered a large area, and it would take too long to meld it down with the Buddhist light. So he decided to use the sword light. The ocean waves suddenly calmed down, and an extremely bright sword light traveled through the ocean at an unimaginable speed, drawing innumerable lines in the sky. Innumerable tiny holes appeared on the blue wall of water, like a beach after a rainstorm. The innumerable beads of blood densely covering the sky shattered one after another, blossoming into flowers and then being purified by the sword light. Even the grandest thing was composed of innumerable details, and that sword light was the best at cutting off the connections between all the details in the world. The sword light traveled through the sky and the ocean, and it was impossible to see it clearly with the naked eye. The terrifying heavenly slaying formation, powerful enough to destroy heaven and earth, gradually stopped operating at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then gradually dissipated from the edges. In fact, it didn't take long, but it felt like a very long time for the unimaginably fast sword light. When the speed reached a certain level, the rules of heaven and earth would undergo some miraculous changes. In Jing Jiu's eyes, the morning sunlight over the ocean seemed to have become fragmented, as if it had a length and a peculiar beauty. Looking at the morning sunlight, he had a strange feeling. My big brother likes to destroy the world, and you like to save the world. But it's so tiring, what's the point? Chapter 721. Countless droplets of blood burst one after another, making light popping sounds. It was as if a torrential rain had fallen on the sea. The heavenly slaying formation was like a giant stone statue eroded by the wind and rain. It slowly wore away, became smaller, and finally collapsed into nothingness. This process seemed simple, but it was actually close to the intrinsic power of time, or a miracle. When the heavenly slaying formation dissipated with the sea breeze, only a few dozen breaths had passed since the arrival of the sword light. But for the sword light, it was unknown how many days had passed. Jing Jiu's figure reappeared, stepping on the waves. His white robe fluttered lightly, but he did not look like an immortal like before. That was because his white robe was full of holes, and his sleeves were torn into shreds. He looked like a beggar and was in a very sorry state. He was also in a bad state, his face pale and full of exhaustion. A huge wave rose on the sea, and the giant came to the edge of the waterfall in one step. He looked at the remaining aura of the heavenly slaying formation in the sky, his face full of shock. He put the giant tree under his armpit and applauded to Jing Jiu to express his praise. Fierce winds whistled out from the giant palm, bringing up several huge waves. Jing Jiu waved his hand. The giant came to his senses and pointed at his head, looking at him with a questioning gaze. He was asking if Jing Jiu was out of his mind. Otherwise, why would he do these things that he would never do in the past? Jing Jiu naturally would not explain things like the morning light and the great path. He waved his hand again and prepared to leave. The giant was even more confused. He pointed at the huge whirlpool, indicating that the sea was still falling into the underworld. What were you going to do? The huge whirlpool was pierced by Baizhenren's immortal fist, forming a huge hole with a radius of over 10 miles. Endless seawater poured down. This was the power of nature. Jing Jiu could break the heavenly slaying formation, but could he still mend this hole? He pointed at the giant, and then at the huge hole at the bottom of the huge whirlpool. Then he raised his palm. What he meant was for the giant to use its huge body to block the hole. The giant shook his head. The layers of clouds in the sky were all shattered. If he went to block the hole, he would be washed into the underworld by the sea. At that time, the citizens of the underworld would be crushed to death by the earthquake he caused. You stay here, I'll be right back. After saying this, Jing Jiu turned into a sword light and rushed into the sea, instantly disappearing without a trace. The giant opened his mouth and couldn't say anything for a long time. He thought to himself, the sky of the underworld has been broken, but you're not in a hurry to mend it. What are you doing? The netherworld had always only had two colors, black and white. Darkness and gray were both intersecting black and white. The fire of the netherworld river was only bright. Today there was an additional color in the netherworld, and that was dark blue. Twice, endless seawater fell from the sky. This strange color did not bring the beauty of the new world, but the shadow of death. The seawater fell from the sky, passing through an incomparably distant space. When it reached the ground of the underworld, it had already become something harder than stone. Whether it was the cliffs, the colorless trees, the strange beasts with poor eyesight, or the people of the underworld, they would all turn into powder under the impact of the seawater. The mountains and fields on both sides of the Netherworld River were filled with horrified screams and wails, but compared to the rumbling sounds of the seawater hitting the ground, the screams were very weak. For the creatures of the underworld, the endless seawater falling from the sky was like hundreds of merciless dark blue dragons, devouring everything here. An extremely bright light suddenly appeared in the dark sky, illuminating the abyss and the dome that appeared irregularly in the abyss like a floating island. The people of the underworld, who had heard the rumors in the human world, looked at the light and subconsciously thought of a somewhat strange but beautiful word, star. In fact, it was a sword light. The extremely bright sword light traveled through the sky of the underworld at an unimaginable speed. In a very short time, it appeared in every place within a radius of more than 100 miles, cutting off all the thick water pillars formed by the seawater, as if it were cutting off the heads of hundreds of dark blue dragons at the same time. The water pillars were cut off and scattered in all directions. Even though they continued to fall to the ground, their power was greatly reduced. The sword light suddenly stopped in the sky of the underworld, and countless bright threads condensed into a human figure. Dozens of sword wills drifted out from the rims of the cloth, tearing a few more holes in it. Jingjiao didn't pay any attention to this, as he looked down at the black and white landscape below. A great deal of seawater had already flowed into the underworld river, generating a great deal of green smoke, casting an eerie and dreadful atmosphere on the black and white landscape. The soldiers of the underworld all over the mountains and fields were like the trees blown down by the strong wind, falling down on the muddy cliffs. Some of them were no longer breathing, and some were convulsing painfully while clutching their throats. Jingjiao had a complicated and close relationship with the underworld, like Apiao, Tongyin, the mosquito, and the underworld master. More importantly, the king of the underworld was his friend. This was the first time he had come to the underworld. He was going to save this world. The swordsmen and priests of the underworld were not affected by the green smoke, and they were still alive. They set up a formation by the banks of the underworld river, encircling a large mountain. That large Buddha was right in the middle of this mountain. The formidable and profound broadsword wills broke through the air, and even the wild grass 100 miles away fell to the ground. Countless soul fires were burning fiercely, forming a huge screen to block the broadsword wills. The underworld master and the grand priest stood at the two ends of the huge screen, and they couldn't hold on for much longer. Some priests chose to commit suicide one after another by exploding their bodies and sending their soul fires into the formation. The iron broadsword had stood alone in the wind and snow for hundreds of years. Nobody dared block it in the underworld today. They had to rely on their own lives to do so. The sky of the underworld was the underground of a human world. As long as they were connected, they would reach heaven. The most important part of Taiping Jinren's method of using heaven and earth as a stove was these passages. There were too many passages leading to the underworld, and nobody knew where Bai Jinren would attack next. As such, Jingjiao didn't intend to follow her to repair the sky. In his opinion, it was not difficult to resolve this matter. All he needed to do was kill all those people who had broken the underworld. He had seen the projected image of the Grand Priest in Zhaoga City back then, so he was certain that he was not mistaken. The blue cloth of the underworld master was also very eye-catching. As such, he couldn't kill the wrong person. After ascertaining the location of the two, Jingjiao informed the distant Oyama sect and turned into that sword light again. The sword light was so bright that it looked like the rumored star. The swordsmen, like the underworld master and the grand priest, had discovered the existence of the sword light as soon as it appeared, and they had also seen its essence. Has the big brother come back to life? The underworld master displayed a shocked expression on his face, and a tremor came out from the deepest part of his soul fires. He He was a disciple of Taiping Zhenren, and also a member of the Aoyama sect. Faced with the sword light, he had no idea or courage to resist it. He turned around abruptly and fled toward the darkness of the night, ignoring the fact that the huge screen formed by the soul fires would disintegrate because of his departure. The Grand Priest reacted a little slower, but it didn't take long for him to react. He let out a fearful and angry shriek, waving his sleeve with the red silk threads in an attempt to flee by employing the escape method of heaven and earth. The water of the underworld river suddenly stilled, and then a crack appeared on it, as if an ice cube had been cut open. The thick green smoke seemed to have stilled for a moment, and a crack appeared in the middle of it as well. A smell of blood and iron came out from those cracks, and then a dazzling glow appeared. The glows gathered together and formed a broadsword light that traversed heaven and earth. The broadsword light had cut open the underworld river and the soul fires, and brought the Grand Priest out from the empty space, as well as the darkness in front of the underworld master. Almost at the same time, the exceedingly bright sword light had arrived by the bank of the underworld river. Crack! Crack! The Grand Priest had countless bloody lines on his body, and then he exploded into a spray of blood, vanishing without a trace. His blue cloth was torn apart like the butterflies. The butterflies were torn apart before they could spread their wings, like the soul fires around the underworld master and his legs that were cut off at the knees. In an instant, one of the two most powerful swordsmen in the underworld was killed, and the other was crippled. It wasn't over yet. The bright sword light traveled forward along with the broadsword will and landed on the black ground. Along with a loud boom, the ground quaked violently, and cracks appeared on the ground. The hard ground strata rubbed against each other and rose to the sky at an oblique angle. In the end, a magnificent mountain range of 100 miles long and 1,000 feet high was formed. The endless seawater falling down from the sky was blocked by this mountain range. The seawater had no choice but to flow to the sides of the underworld river. More than 100 years ago, Lucy's sword light illuminated the cold mountain at night. Chao Yuan pulled out his broadsword and responded in the distant white town. The scorching sun gorge leapt up from the ground and then fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. The number one deviant sect, the mysterious dark sect, had vanished. More than 100 years later, the sword light illuminated the underworld, and the iron broadsword responded again. However, the mountain didn't vanish this time. Instead, a mountain range appeared in the world. The turbulent seawater kept on crashing into the mountain range, making thudding sounds like the thunders and creating huge waves. Looking down from the sky, the mountain range looked like a sturdy dam. Jingjiu pulled back his gaze and looked at Chao Yuan, saying, "The seawater will bypass the mountain range in 8 hours." Chao Yuan said, "I'll use my broadsword then, but I won't be able to block it for too long. And you won't be able to hold on for too long in your current condition." The green smoke generated by the collision of the seawater and the underworld river hovered around the large Buddha, resembling the incense burning in the temple. He kept on inhaling the green smoke, and his exposed abdomen bulged more and more, looking like a true Buddha who was satiated by the incense burning. "It's too late for you." The deep and painful voice of the underworld master burst out at the bottom of a cliff. If it were someone else, they would want to know why the underworld master was willing to help Bai Zhenren. Did he and the Grand Priest regard the beings in the underworld as the ants? Jingjiu didn't have time to think about it, nor did he care about it. He turned into a sword light and left. A bright line appeared on the gloomy underworld river. The white lotus flower broke into pieces, looking like the natural silk swaying in the wind at the 3,000 nunnery. The sword light soon disappeared into the darkness. It was not necessary to know the cause of a problem to be solved. For instance, one didn't need to know how the potato sprouted when one wanted to stir-fry a plate of potato chips. The drinkers in the brothel were too noisy. The servants riding the horses were too noisy. Some of them beat their wives and children, but one didn't need to know what was going on in their minds. One could simply cut them all with a swing of the sword. Chapter 722. The underworld river was not the water of the human world, so the marks on it had disappeared very quickly, and so had the fragrance of the white lotus flower. The sword light disappeared in the dark and gloomy night sky. The figure of Jing Jiao appeared, looking at the dim surroundings. He hadn't been to the underworld, so he didn't know the exact locations of those passages, but he knew how to get back to the human world. However, there were many passages leading from the underworld to the human world, and there were almost 10 important passages. Where will Bai Yuan go? Would she go to the 1,000-mile wind corridor or the other 2 huge whirlpools? Jing Jiao flipped his palm reflexively, but nothing appeared. He remembered that Cold Cicada had already gone to the outside world with the Snow Girl. A few invisible mosquitoes left his palm and flew toward the high sky. A bright glint flashed in Jing Jiao's eyes. After ascertaining the direction, Jing Jiao recalled the mosquitoes. There was an abyss between the underworld and the human world, as well as the broken pieces of space and the hard cliffs like the floating islands. As the sword light flashed, Jing Jiao appeared in front of cliff wall. Looking at the transparent and glass-like object, he furrowed his eyebrows slightly. This was the bottom of the fiend prison, the strongest barrier in the world. Yet, there was nothing he couldn't break through in his current state. The reason he furrowed his eyebrows was not because he found it difficult to break through, but because he didn't like it. With a light sound, an almost invisible mark appeared on the transparent glass. Besides those invisible mosquitoes, the sword light was the only thing that could pass through it. The morning sun had already risen, and Zhaoga City woke up from its deep sleep. After more than 100 years of wind and rain, Taichung Temple was not as rigid as it was after it was rebuilt, and it had a sense of vicissitudes of history. The stone path leading to the fiend prison in the backyard was full of heavy ruts. The purple wildflowers in the garden were growing very well, but for some reason, they had never been picked. As the gentle wind blew over, a sword light illuminated the dark eaves of Taichung Temple, as if the dead old dragon was about to wake up. Standing among the patch of purple wildflowers, Jing Jiao recalled the time when he was in the fiend prison and that friend of his. Along with the gentle wind, the sword light traveled in Zhaoga City. It was so dark that it was impossible to see it. The sword light passed by the Jing house where a begonia tree had been planted, the grand hall of the Net Perception Temple that had been moved to the Jing house, and the restaurant where Taiping Jinren used to drink tea. Of course, there was also the Imperial City. This was where he was born and where he had slept for many years. Many stories had happened here, and many people had lived here. The Empress Dowager sat in front of the window and looked at the Zen character on the wall with a dazed expression. Standing on top of the city wall, Gu Pan gazed at the bustling Zhaoga City. The hair on his temples shone brightly under the sunlight, and the expression in his eyes was exceedingly calm, as if he was appreciating the human world under his protection. On the street outside the old plum garden, the people who had set up stalls greeted each other and rubbed their tired faces, preparing to start today's life of swindling money. The steam in the breakfast shop had already dissipated, and the last half a steamer of beef buns was calmly placed on the table. The surface of the buns was oozing with blood-like oily soup, and it looked extremely disgusting. Across the street, a little beggar looked at the beef buns and kept swallowing his saliva. The spring sun shone on Zhaoga City. Everything was peaceful and beautiful. Of course, there was some ugliness, but everything was normal. Some of them knew that something big had happened in Aoyama yesterday. Some saw the strange twilight of yesterday, but they didn't know that this world was in the process of being destroyed. Jing Yao and the diplomatic mission of the imperial court were still on their way back. Gu Qing hadn't returned to Zhaoga City yet, because he had come too soon. When he asked Gu Qing to leave Aoyama and hurry back to Zhaoga City last night, he hadn't thought of saving the world by himself. As the sword light traveled in Zhaoga City, Jing Jiao saw these scenes, and he seemed to see many scenes in the fragments of time, and then he thought of many things. Zhao Liu couldn't figure out why he was willing to take such a great risk to save the world, and it was hard for him to explain it himself. It probably had something to do with the cause and effect. To explain these reasons, he had to think it over. Of course, he didn't need to think it over to know that he wanted to do so, and that was enough for him. A few moments later, Jingjiu had seen the whole of Zhaoga City, and he was certain that Bai Zhenren was not here. It was because the sword light moved too fast that he could think of so many things and recall so many memories in such a short time. There was a small pavilion on the chessboard mountain outside Zhaoga City, which had been sealed off by the imperial court a long time ago. For the cultivation circle and the highly achieved chess players, this pavilion was a holy place. There was a Go board in the pavilion, and the black and white Go pieces on the board looked like two armies confronting each other, with countless hidden sharpness between them, which could even be called wind and thunder. All of a sudden, the black and white Go pieces on the Go board were illuminated by a sword light, and they suddenly became lively, as if they were about to come to life. The sword light passed through countless green trees, leaving countless fallen leaves behind, and headed toward the northeast, soon disappearing into the sky. By the time the sword light reappeared, it had already arrived at the 1,000-mile wind corridor. One day and one night later, the wind here was not as dreadful as before, but it was still whistling like a knife. The walls of the inn were full of cracks, and many wooden planks were even broken. The green trees by the roadside had fallen to the ground a long time ago, looking quite miserable. The sword light didn't linger at the inn. It went into the deep part of the 1,000-mile wind corridor with the wind and stopped by the lotus pond. "I've been here already," Jingjiu thought to himself while looking at the broken lotus leaves on the surface of the lake. Though everything looked calm and peaceful, there was actually an undercurrent at the bottom of the lake, and it was not the current of the water, but the wind. Though he looked calm, the tiredness couldn't be concealed at the end of his eyes. His white cloth was ruffled by the wind, looking like a flag shot through by countless arrows on the battlefield, torn and tattered. After leaving Aoyama, he went to the heavenly well by the East Ocean, went to the deep part of the ocean, and then went to the underworld, killed the grand priest, and crippled the underworld master. In the end, he came back to the human world and took a look at Zhaoga City. It was then that he stopped for the first time. In fact, it only took him less than an hour to finish all of this. This had never happened in Chaotian before. Even Lu Ci's sword light that night was not as good as this. This was a true miracle. No matter how outstanding he was, his sword wills were almost exhausted, and he needed to rest for a while. Walking on the surface of the lake, Jingjiu looked like a ferryman who had returned after a great many years, covered in dust. The broken lotus quivered slightly, and the water rippled slightly. The inky snake in the distance poked his head out and bowed to Jingjiu reverently. It didn't take long for him to arrive at the end of the 1,000-mile wind corridor. He saw the rocky mountain that was even more tattered than his clothes, and the scholars of Yamatai around the rocky mountain who looked more exhausted than him, and that saint covered in blood. Bu Qiuxiao's blood hadn't stopped flowing. Even though the blood would coagulate once in a while, it would be cut open by him. It was because the blood of the saint was the only thing that could seal this passage leading to the underworld. Yet, the amount of blood on his body was a bit too much. The blood had a golden glow, which was similar to the fairy energy. However, the blood on the rocky mountain had grown dimmer, and the golden glow had almost disappeared. There was no time for pleasantries at the moment, let alone congratulations. "Why is she so fast?" asked Jingjiu. "It's the escape method of heaven and earth reinforced by the fairy energy. She's not as fast as you, but she's still fast enough." Looking at Shi Yun's ice-cold body not far away, Bu Qiuxiao said, "She sneak-attacked me and wounded me, but I can hold on for a while." Jingjiu followed his line of sight and saw the corpses of a dozen scholars of Yamatai. "You might have to hold on for another 4 hours," he said after a moment of silence. Looking at Jingjiu's face, Bu Qiuxiao asked, "Can you hold on?" "I should be able to," replied Jingjiu. The whole of Chaotian, or even the whole of heaven and earth, had fallen into a stalemate. Using heaven and earth as a furnace was truly an unparalleled method. The truly powerful swordsmen who had the ability to change the situation couldn't leave their places for various reasons. Bu Xiao couldn't leave the 1,000-mile wind corridor. The giant couldn't leave the huge whirlpool. Chao Yuan couldn't leave the underworld. And the small green curtained sedan couldn't leave the heavenly well. It was because they wanted to keep this world alive. But how long could they hold on? The most important question was, how long could Jingzhou hold on? The first thing Bai Junren did after returning to the human world was to go to Yamatai and wound Bu Xiao, a new saint, before disappearing from heaven and earth. It was evident that she intended to wait until Jingzhou and these powerful swordsmen couldn't hold on any longer. If Jingzhou didn't intend to turn around, he had to find her and kill her within 4 hours. But where was Bai Junren at the moment? The sword light illuminated the lotus flowers on the surface of the lake, the bloodstains on the rocky mountain, the eyes of the scholars of Yamatai, and the clouds and fog on the Cloud Dream Mountain all year long. The cloud boat of the Zhongzhou school was still on its way. Because of Tong Yin, Jing Jiao, and Lu Xi had entered the great formation of Cloud Dream once. Even without these prerequisites, what formation in the world could block this sword light? The heavenly slaying formation couldn't do it, and the great formation of Cloud Dream couldn't either. The clouds and fog sank slightly, and then a tiny hole appeared. In the next moment, a tree by a high platform in a valley was broken, and so was the stream. A crack appeared on the ground, extending to the deep end of the valley. It was unclear where the crack led to. This was the deepest part of the underground, and also the deepest part of the great formation of Cloud Dream. It had the darkest night and the most beautiful starry sky, as if it could lead to the fairy world from the human world. There was a huge figure in the faint fog, exuding an unimaginable energy. Jingyang, you are too arrogant. The angry roar tore apart all the fog. The unicorn had finally revealed his true form. It was hard to describe in words. If the dead dog was like a black rocky mountain, the unicorn was like the black mountain, covered with colorful banners and inlaid with all kinds of gems. The banners were bright and full of the aura of gems. They were awe-inspiring at first sight, but they also made the onlookers feel disgusted and ugly. Regardless of whether he was beautiful or ugly, he was nevertheless the oldest being in Chaotian and a divine animal of the highest state, possessing the power to turn heaven and earth upside down. Apart from the queen of the snowy kingdom, nobody in the world could be his equal. The reason the dead dog could intimidate him was because the dead dog fought with all his might. Yet, Jingzhou didn't show any alarm in his eyes. "Where is Bai Yuan?" he asked calmly. The unicorn snapped angrily. "How would I know?" Jingzhou pressed. "If she knew I wanted to kill you, would she show up?" The unicorn laughed out loud, as if he had heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. "Even though you are the all-in-one, do you think you can kill me easily? Don't forget that I'm a true divine animal. You haven't seen my true cultivation state and prowess. Do you think you're so great just because you are fast?" "Ha ha!" The unicorn's laughter suddenly stopped, and an incredulous and angry expression appeared in his eyes. It was unclear when Jingzhou opened his right hand, an ancient bell in his palm. It was the scenic cloud bell. Chapter 723. Countless cracks had appeared on the ground beneath Jingzhou. If it weren't for the fact that this was the core of the Cloudy Dream Grand Formation, and the ground was as hard as a magic treasure, Jingzhou would have been pressed into the ground. Being as heavy as a mountain was one of the most important characteristics of the scenic cloud clock. The Qilin looked at the scenic cloud bell in his hand, and the disbelief and anger in its eyes gradually turned into fear and fear. Even its breathing became a lot more rapid, and its front hooves kept tapping the ground lightly, and its waist slightly bent. It was not thinking of escaping, but preparing to kneel down. The scenic cloud bell was the most precious treasure of Zhongzhou School. It had unimaginable power, but it couldn't be used in the air like a magic weapon. However, if it rang in the ears of a cultivator, no matter if it was a supreme being or a so-called banished immortal, their spirit would collapse, and they would be in excruciating pain. Back in the Battle of Zhaoga City, Even someone as powerful as Lien Sanue was wary of the scenic cloud bell in the hands of the immortal Tan. It was the day before that the underworld master, the #1 swordsman in the underworld, was almost killed by Tong Yan's sneak attack with the scenic cloud bell. Right now, no one in the world could match Jing Jiu's speed. If he were to chase after his opponent with the scenic cloud bell, it would indeed be an undefeatable killing move. The problem was that Qilin was a real ancient divine beast, possessing unimaginable natural pressure and realm strength. Just as he had said, no one knew how many tricks he had hidden. Logically speaking, even if he was afraid of the scenic cloud bell in Jing Jiu's hands, he shouldn't be so afraid. He was simply inferior to Ada. Why was that? Legend has it that the scenic cloud bell is your natural divine artifact, and it has been tied to your neck since ancient times. Jing Jiu looked at the Qilin and said, "And I don't believe in any myths or legends." He was a legend in Chao Tian himself, so he knew that the legends were often far from the truth, but they had some inexplicable connections. For example, it was said in the cultivation world that Emperor Shao was hiding in a turtle shell, which was obviously influenced by the round turtle. In fact, it was just one of the strongest treasures in the world. Sometimes it was a turtle shell, sometimes it was a clam. If Emperor Shao wanted to, he could even turn it into a palace. Sometimes this connection was even more interesting. Legends and the truth could be completely opposite. If the scenic cloud bell was not a natural divine object of the Qilin, why would it be tied to its neck, and why would it become a magic weapon that only the head of Zhongzhou school could possess? He only needed to make a simple deduction to get an answer that was close to the truth. In fact, he and Taiping Zhenren already had this answer hundreds of years ago, but it was only today that he received confirmation from the Qilin's reaction. The scenic cloud bell was not a natural divine item of the Qilin, but a divine item that was born to restrain it. It might have been born naturally, or might have been made by a powerful person in ancient times, or it might have been made by the founder of Zhongzhou School. The reason why the Aoyama sect had the sky-bearing scabbard to counter the all-in-one sword was the same. Hearing Jing Jiu's words, Qilin knew that he knew the true use of the scenic cloud bell. Anger flashed in the depths of his eyes. He forcibly suppressed the trembling in his heart and said, "You used the treasure of Zhongzhou School to deal with me, a divine beast of Zhongzhou School. Don't you think it's too much?" Jing Jiu said, "Very suitable." Qilin yelled desperately and angrily, "This has nothing to do with me." Jing Jiu said, "I'm also wondering why Bai Yuan didn't take you with her when she did this." Qilin said, "I'm a highly achieved ferryman. It's not a big deal to kill a few people once in a while, but how could I do such a thing? Isn't I afraid that the heavenly Tao will punish me?" The change in the energy of heaven and earth couldn't escape the perception of a divine beast of ancient times. "Immortal, please calm down. That little girl Bai Yuan is obviously crazy. That's why she would do such a heinous thing." Qilin continued helplessly while looking at Jing Jiu. "If so, why would she care about my life and death?" Jing Jiu said, "In that case, she wouldn't show herself even if she knew I wanted to kill you." "That's right," Qilin said earnestly. "If I can't kill her in 2 hours, I'll come back and kill you." Having said that, Jing Jiu put away the scenic cloud bell and turned to leave Cloud Dream Mountain. The bright sword light broke through the endless clouds and fog and returned to the fields and mountains and rivers in Chaotian, traveling and traveling at an unimaginably high speed. The sword light had seen the whole human world, and it was also seen by the whole human world. The mortals in the towns and villages thought they had seen an ominous shooting star in the daytime, feeling unlucky and spitting at it incessantly. The people of various cultivation sects didn't think so. Looking at the fleeting sword light in the sky, they felt awed and yearned to see it. On a huge cloud boat, the immortal Tan put away the bloody handkerchief. Looking at the sword light in heaven and earth, the wrinkles on his broad forehead grew deeper as he sighed. The people in Aoyama had also seen the sword light, but their emotions and reactions varied. On the top of Shima Peak, Lu Shui pressed his palms together and recited the script he had learned from the Guoqing Temple in a low voice. Yuan Shu was calculating the speed of the sword light and the number of passages leading to the underworld with a pen and paper in his hands, in an attempt to figure out how long it would take the immortal sect master to find Bai Junren. Lying on the bamboo chair, Zhuo Ruzhui held his head with both hands, pondering something. As the sword light traveled in the human world, Ping Yongka was reciting the sword instructions on the sword peak. His face was pale, and his sword wills had been greatly consumed. His finger pointing at the sky trembled incessantly. Rather than saying that he was controlling the sword, the current situation was more like the sword light was guiding his will. Zhao Lei didn't look at the sword light in the sky. She had been staring at Ping Yongka's face the entire time. Guang Yunjinren thought that she was worried that Ping Yongka wouldn't be able to hold on, and that the immortal sect master wouldn't be able to transform into a sword to travel. Nan Wang thought that she was thinking of a way to replace Ping Yongka with the acquired shapeless sword body. Qing was the only one who knew that she had another idea in addition to all these. Do you intend to find out his weakness so that you can kill him at any time in the future? Qing flew to the back of Zhao Leiyu and asked gingerly through her spiritual awareness. After a moment of silence, Zhao Leiyu nodded imperceptibly. The sword light had gone to various places in the human world. It had gone to all the places where Bai Junren might be. Jing Jiao had checked the passages leading to the underworld on the cold mountain, and he had even gone to the huge whirlpool in the underworld. In the end, he had stayed by the seashore of the East Ocean for a while. In the end, he didn't find anything, and the time was up. As such, he returned to the Cloud Dream Mountain and entered the deep end of the great formation of Cloud Dream, arriving in front of the unicorn. I thought you would try to escape, said Jing Jiao, seeing his pale face in the dim but crazily glint in the deep end of his eyes. The unicorn knew that Jing Jiao was about to strike with his sword. Can I be faster than you? He demanded angrily. You can hide like Bai Yuan, said Jing Jiao. The unicorn said helplessly, Can you stop testing me? I really don't know where she is, and I don't know what method she has used to conceal her energy. Then I have no choice but to kill you, said Jing Jiao. The unicorn showed a satisfied and cruel expression in his eyes as he said, But I have just thought of something. Jing Jiao took out the scenic cloud bell, saying nothing. The unicorn said urgently, Have you forgotten about Longevity Mountain? Longevity Mountain was located in the southeast of Chaotian, a distance away from the Guoqing Temple and Shui Nunnery. This mountain was a mausoleum of the previous dynasty, which had been occupied by the No Mercy sect many years ago and became the headquarters of their sect. Pei Baifa left the human world after the duel with the godly swordsmen of West Ocean. The No Mercy sect had no one in the heavenly arrival state, so they were forced to seal off the mountain to protect themselves. Except for their registered disciple, Lu Shui, nobody else had shown up. The mausoleum of the previous dynasty had a formation that shielded the energy, and the No Mercy sect had activated the Great Formation to seal off the mountain, isolating it from heaven and earth. That was why nobody could sense the energy of Bai Junren. More importantly, there was a passage leading to the underworld under the mausoleum of the previous dynasty. The No Mercy sect had guarded this passage for generations, and many of their members had died there. The green cliff was illuminated by the sword lights, and then returned to normal. The mountain wind ruffled his white cloth, bringing up a few strands of it, which merged with the receding sword lights. Standing in the clouds and looking down at the rolling hills, Jing Jiao raised his eyebrows slightly again, like a sword about to be drawn out of its sheath. The Aoyama sect and the No Mercy sect had been on good terms for generations. Jing Jiao had traveled here many years ago, but he didn't like the energy here. It had nothing to do with the dark energy of the mausoleum or the dark wind from the underworld. The emperors and empresses of the previous dynasty were buried in this mausoleum, but Jing Jiao was a descendant of the Jing royal family, so he had a bad feeling about it. The formation of the mausoleum of the previous dynasty was nothing to him, but the great formation of the No Mercy sect was indeed formidable. It was like a shapeless and indestructible cover covering an area of 100 square miles, blocking out all the sunlight and raindrops. Yet, Jingjiu was quite good at cutting it off. His gaze fell on Longevity Mountain. Soon, he had seen every cliff and even every ancient tree, and he found the only passage leading to this formation. The Aoyama sect and the No Mercy sect were allies who would go through life and death together. As the sect master of Aoyama, it was inappropriate for Jingjiu to break the formation. Yet, he didn't give it much thought, flying toward the formation. The bright sword light illuminated an ancient tree and broke through the bark of the tree, disappearing instantly. As it reappeared, it was already inside the great formation. The elders and disciples of the No Mercy sect were cultivating behind closed doors in their manor caves, so they didn't sense the arrival of the sword light. The formidable sword will merely disturb countless fallen leaves. Isolated by the great formation of the No Mercy sect, the temperature here was different from that in Chaotian. It seemed to be autumn here. The yellow leaves were flying around like countless butterflies dancing in the air. The sword light broke through countless yellow leaves and arrived in front of the grand hall of the No Mercy sect. It broke through the thick stone door soundlessly, heading toward the deep end of Longevity Mountain. This grand hall was the front temple of the mausoleum of the previous dynasty. The inside of the mausoleum was the inside of it. Countless crisp and faint cracking sounds rang out. The sword light had broken through dozens of stone walls and 7 halls in a row, and had finally arrived at the deep end of the mausoleum. A famous tyrant of the previous dynasty was buried in this mausoleum. The structure of the mausoleum was unusual, and the mausoleum was very tall. The coffin made of white jade in the center of the mausoleum exuded a cold and gloomy aura. Baizhenren was hiding in that white jade coffin. There was a soft clank sound. The white jade coffin broke apart. The bright sword light drifted into it, but it stopped. This sword light had cut a gorge and created a mountain. Nobody in heaven or on earth could resist it, but it was blocked by something. This was the most unimaginable thing in the world. The sword light stopped. The broken pieces of the white jade coffin fell down like snowflakes. Jingjiu's figure appeared. Baizhenren looked at Jingjiu in silence, holding a mussel in his hand. Jingjiu's finger was clamped by the mussel. Chapter 724. You scoundrels. Let's see what you can come up with without the chapters and book reviews today. I wish you all a happy holiday. Many years ago, when Jingjiu came to Longevity Mountain for the first time, he didn't like the energy here. At the time, he thought it was because many descendants of the previous dynasty were buried in this mausoleum. He didn't pay much attention to the feeling when he came to Longevity Mountain today. It wasn't until now that his finger was clamped by the shell of the clam that he realized it was an ominous sign. The clam looked ordinary, with a grayish hue and not smooth, and its surface didn't have any nice curved lines. Jingjiu, of course, knew the origin of this clam, and he had brought his disciples to Ozawa to look for it. This was the clam of Emperor Shao. Emperor Shao was the third hidden swordsman in Chaotian. He had been fanning the flames of the world with Taiping Zhenren and had killed many innocent people. His cultivation state was lower than that of the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect, and he was far inferior to Nanchu. It was because of this clam that he had survived the threat of the sword formation of Aoyama until now. Of course, in the legends of the cultivation circle, this clam usually appeared in the form of a tortoise shell. Why did the clam of Emperor Shao appear in the hands of Baizhenren? Jingjiu didn't have the time to ponder this question, because he had already stopped moving. The flow of time was no longer the same as before, and he was facing the most serious crisis since his rebirth. The clam might be able to block the attack of the sword formation of Aoyama, but it couldn't block the all-in-one sword, but it could at least hold on for a while. No matter how short the time was, it would be more than enough to delay the sword light for a split second. It was because it was Baizhenren who was holding the clam. With a crisp cracking sound, a deep crack appeared on the clam, and some flying ash was shaken up. Before Jingjiu's finger left the clam, Bai Jinren's fist had arrived. A loud bang resounded. Her fist landed squarely on his face. The fist was small, but it was as heavy as a mountain. In fact, it was more accurate to say that the fist contained the weight of the whole sky. Countless rays of golden light seeped out from between the fingers of the fist. The golden light was not only the immortal aura in the fairy book, but also the imperial aura in the mausoleum of the former dynasty. Both the fairy energy of Bai Run and the royal energy of the former royal family were the things that Jing Jiao disliked the most, and they could restrain him the most. An unimaginable amount of immortal qi and sovereign qi illuminated the jade, shavings falling down like snow, and illuminated the gloomy mausoleum. Jing Jiao's eyes were as bright as crystals under the illumination of the sunlight. The skin on his face was also like transparent jade. The crystal dimmed slightly. The transparent jade was slightly deformed. He flew backward. Boom, 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 boom. Countless dull, crashing sounds rang out. When he had entered the mausoleum, he had been an insufferably arrogant sword light as a piece of paper. When he was sent flying, he was like a stone, rudely and somewhat pitifully destroying those thick stone walls. He was directly sent flying out of the mausoleum, retreating over 10 li. In the end, he landed heavily on a cliff, forming a large hole and sending countless rocks flying. Bai Jinren flew out of the mausoleum. Innumerable, blazing rays of light shot out from the spring sun in the sky, passing through the great formation of the No Mercy sect to seal off the mountain, and falling on the cliff in the deep autumn. It was all because of the fairy book in her hand. At the same time, innumerable strands of imperial aura gushed out from various passageways of the mausoleum, arriving below by Junren like dust dragons. Without the imperial aura, Longevity Mountain's ability to suppress the passageways of the underworld was naturally weakened. As far as Bai Jinren was concerned, this was killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The rays of light coming down from the spring sun, summoned by the fairy book, weaved into a bright yet invisible curtain, which was on the verge of shrouding the entire cliff. Some mud suddenly splashed up from a patch of wildflowers on the side of the cliff, and an extremely small hole appeared. Then, a sword light drifted out of the hole, heading toward the outside of the mountain at a high speed. The sword light looked very weak and tiny, like an earthworm dug out by a farmer, fleeing desperately into the distance, looking quite pitiful. This sword light was still unimaginably fast, and even the sunlight summoned by the fairy book couldn't block it. However, in Bai Jinren's eyes, this sword light was evidently much slower than before. It was because the trace of the sword light was a bit unsteady, indicating that the all-in-one sword was a bit bent. In other words, Jing Jiao had been severely wounded by the punch. Even though he was slightly wounded, it was still the most powerful all-in-one sword in the world, and it should be able to fight one more time against Bai Jinren, who had the fairy book in his hand. Why did he flee? Bai Jinren was somewhat surprised, but he couldn't help but curl up the corners of his mouth, revealing a mocking expression as he thought of how Jing Yang and Jing Jiu had behaved in their 2 lives. Heaven and earth were the stove, and everything was being cooked. There wasn't much time left for this world. It was for this reason that Jing Jiu was in a hurry to find Bai Jinren and kill her, and then go back to deal with the other troublesome issues. Yet, he didn't expect that Bai Jinren had been waiting to kill him the entire time, as well as the whole world. It seemed that the unicorn's speech was something she had prepared in advance. Many holes appeared in the mausoleum on Longevity Mountain, and the white jade coffin turned into snow, and a large amount of royal energy leaked out from the underground. And the clam was obviously the doing of Emperor Shao. The wounded Jing Jiao vanished in the sky. Bai Jinren employed the escape method of heaven and earth by employing the fairy energy, and arrived above the empty realm in a blink of an eye. She looked around, but she couldn't find the crooked sword light. She couldn't help but raise her eyebrows slightly. From Chaotian to the underworld, Jing Jiao had pursued her for more than 2 hours, which felt like a lifetime. Unexpectedly, the situation had taken a turn for the worse, and it was her turn to pursue Jing Jiao. Her situation was better than Jingjiu's because it was easier to destroy than to build. In addition to killing Jingjiu, she had more choices, and they were better choices. The passage to the underworld here was about to be opened, but the opening of the passages to the underworld and other places had some problems. She had to solve those problems in order to make the great furnace of heaven and earth operate as soon as possible. The passage leading to the underworld that was closest to Longevity Mountain was by the East Ocean, which was the heavenly well. The green smoke rose up again after the seawater entered the underworld, but it couldn't disperse after encountering an invisible barrier. The small sedan with green curtains hovered above the heavenly well in silence. The peach blossoms on the green curtains grew brighter, and a great deal of fresh energy enveloped the cliff by the seashore. The method employed by Shui Nunnery was much gentler and more effective than that of Chao Yuan. After making sure that the green smoke couldn't break through the forbidding formation, Tong Yin felt relieved. As she was about to go to the rescue of Shui Nunnery and the colleagues of the Guochang Temple who had suffered heavy casualties, she suddenly found that her shadow on the ground grew darker. The reason her shadow grew darker was because the sunlight had lessened. He lifted his head abruptly and looked at the sun in the sky, his pale face full of shock and despair. A figure dropped down from a high spot in the sky. Judging from the height, the person must have come from the empty realm. Seen from the ground, the person looked as if he had jumped out from the sun, taking away the sunlight from the sun. The scorching sunlight was blocked, but the edge of the white cloth was framed with a layer of gold. Tong Yin was quite familiar with the energy, so she knew who it was. That was why she felt so despaired. The white dress with the golden edges looked like a cloud. Bai Jinren landed from the sky and slapped at the small green curtained sedan with his palm. It seemed that he didn't take a look at Tong Yin during the whole process. He didn't notice how pale the face of his favorite disciple was and how despaired his eyes were. Whoosh! The top of the small green curtained sedan opened like a flower, and a palm as white as jade came out from the sedan, heading toward Bai Jinren's palm. Huh! The two palms met, and a great amount of strong wind whipped up. The green curtain was fluttering restlessly, like the wine banners in the outside the 1,000-mile wind corridor that were on the verge of being torn apart by the chaotic wind. Countless huge waves rose up on the surface of the East Ocean, looking like thousands of white lines. But they didn't roll toward the shore, instead heading toward the deep part of the ocean. Bai Jinren's countenance was nonchalant, but he showed a strong self-confidence, giving off a feeling of being unparalleled in the world. Though Shui Nunnery was a figure in the heavenly arrival state, Bai Jinren didn't take him seriously. She didn't even use the fairy book and was ready to send him to the deep part of the heavenly well. All of a sudden, a strange expression appeared in her eyes. Clank! The tip of a sword suddenly appeared in Shui Nunnery's palm, as white as jade. The sword pierced through Bai Jinren's palm easily, and then turned into a streak of sword light. The sword light pierced through her arm and instantly came out from the back of her shoulder, producing a spray of blood. Chapter 725. The sword light could cut off all the connections between the details of the object when it entered it. In other words, it could cut the object into pieces. Normally, the moment the sword light left Bai Jinren's body, she should have broken into pieces and died. Yet it didn't happen. It was because a bright golden glow appeared in the deep end of her eyes the moment the sword light entered her palm. The sword light seemed to have encountered a barrier in her body. In the end, it only pierced through her arm, causing blood to spurt out like a rainstorm. Bai Jinren turned around like the cloud and drifted into the rain of blood, disappearing from her sight. It seemed like she'd actually utilized her final master node in order to avoid the calamity of death. The moment before she disappeared, her face was illuminated by the sunlight, and one could vaguely see something different about her. The sword light broke through the ocean waves and returned to the sky above the heavenly well, where the figure of Jingjiu showed up. He looked in the direction of the southeast, a sword light flashing in his eyes. He saw the intermittently visible energy in the sunlight. and turned into a sword light again to pursue the source. Both Jingjio, who had turned into a sword light, and Bai Zhenren, who had the fairy book in his hand, were the most powerful fighters in this part of heaven and earth. Unless the fairy lady Bai Ren came back to life, or the snow girl came back to life, no one in this world could be so powerful, not even Xiao Yuan. They were the only ones qualified to pursue and kill each other. In fact, they had wounded each other severely in a short time, but it was unclear who would win in the end. Bai Zhenren entered heaven and earth, and the sword light chased after him. The seashore of the East Ocean had recovered its quietness. As the gentle wind blew over, the green curtain tousled slightly and then broke into countless pieces, exposing the face of the person in the sedan. The chief nun of the Watermoon Nunnery looked like an ordinary and pretty girl. Her face was a bit pale at the moment, with a trickle of blood on the corners of her mouth. She must have suffered a severe injury in order to block the palm strike from Bai Zhenren. Only by doing so could she find a chance to sneak attack Bai Zhenren. In the early morning, the sword light was looking for Bai Zhenren in the human world and stopped for a while by the EC. It was at that time that Tong Yin came up with this sneak attack plan for Jingjio. After that, Jingjio went to the No Mercy sect after hearing what the unicorn had said after he returned to the Cloud Dream Mountain. Bai Zhenren sneak attacked him successfully. Looking at the badly damaged green curtain sedan, Tong Yin asked, "Is the abbess all right?" Shui Yu Nunnery looked at him and suddenly asked, "Do you know you don't have a good reputation in the cultivation world?" Tong Yin said calmly, "I know." He was once a genius disciple of Zhongzhou School, but he suddenly betrayed the school and disappeared without a trace. It was only in recent years that the cultivation world found out that he had switched sides to the Aoyama sect, but this was actually not important. For an important figure like the chief nun of the Watermoon Nunnery, the childish appearance was not something she liked or even feared. For instance, when Bai Zhenren descended from the sky, his pale face and helpless eyes. "How does it feel to deceive one's former master?" asked Shui Yu Nunnery with a complicated emotion. Tong Yin didn't say anything after some thought. The tomb of the former imperial court was located in the deepest part of Longevity Mountain. When the sunlight reached this place, after passing through a dozen holes created by Jingjio, it had become very dim. The white jade coffin had turned into snowflakes all over the ground. A middle-aged man with a lean face and an extraordinary bearing looked at the slightly cracked turtle shell in his hand, letting out an indescribable sigh. He looked like a scholar who was appreciating the snow and preparing to recite a poem. Yet, the bright yellow royal robe exuded a faint, awe-inspiring, and genuine royal aura, indicating that his true identity was not so simple. He was Emperor Xiao, a descendant of the former imperial court, the true culprit of the turmoil in the world hundreds of years ago, the last hidden swordsman in Chaotian. He was also a companion of Taiping Zhenren, or a military counselor. Using heaven and earth as the stove and destroying the world with the green smoke was a scheme he and Taiping Zhenren had devised together. Though this scheme looked grand and crude, it was actually very meticulous. He had calculated all the details by Ozawa for more than 100 years. However, Taiping Zhenren had died in the hermit peaks of Aoyama. Bai Zhenren had shown up after hundreds of years of painstaking efforts had all gone to waste. "My path is not lonely." Emperor Xiao walked toward the outside of the tomb after making this sentimental remark. A large amount of royal aura dispersed toward the outside of the tomb, ruffling his royal robe slightly, followed by a chilly and gloomy wind. How could he not be sentimental? His ancestors were buried here. As he came to the outside of the main temple of the tomb, Emperor Xiao turned his head around and glanced at the horizontal board in the hall, raising his eyebrows slightly. Since the No Mercy sect dared use the tomb of their ancestors as their mountain gate, they deserved to be wiped out. Hundreds of years ago, he launched his first revenge on the human world in this place. He failed that time. Would he fail again this time? "Who are you?" A voice burst out at the foot of the stone steps. Emperor Xiao turned around and looked in the direction. A young man stood under a tree. His appearance was ordinary, and so was his energy. The sunlight shone on his face as it was cut by the leaves, but it didn't make him look mysterious. Instead, he looked a bit ridiculous. The young man wore the uniform of the No Mercy sect, with a sword tied to his waist. Since he hadn't merged with the sword yet, his cultivation state must be low. Emperor Shao led by Zhenren to sneak into Longevity Mountain, and Jing Jiu barged in. Besides, the tomb was broken and the royal aura leaked out, so the great formation of the mountain sealing off the mountain must have sensed it. It was believed that the elders and disciples of the No Mercy sect would wake up one after another and leave the manor cave behind closed doors. For some reason, this young disciple with a low cultivation state was the first one to come here. You've sealed off the mountain for 100 years, but you still can't see a ray of sunlight. It's really pitiful. Emperor Shao said sentimentally while looking at this young disciple of the No Mercy sect. I have to say that heaven and earth are indeed fair. You people insist that heaven and earth are unkind, so don't blame heaven and earth for being unkind. Back when Pei Baifa was killed by the godly swordsmen of West Ocean, the No Mercy sect didn't have anyone in the heavenly arrival state, so they sealed off their mountain. More than 100 years had passed, and the No Mercy sect hadn't finished sealing off their mountain, meaning that they hadn't welcomed a swordsman in the heavenly arrival state yet. As such, Emperor Shao had nothing to worry about. He walked down the stone steps and headed toward the outside of the mountain, without even glancing at the young disciple under the tree. It's true that we've sealed off our mountain for 100 years, but it doesn't mean that we could be humiliated by anybody. The young disciple of the No Mercy sect said this in a trembling voice while untying the sword tied to his waist. His movement of untying the sword was a bit clumsy and unskillful. It was evident that he didn't have much fighting experience. Emperor Shao halted his steps and looked at the young man under the tree, saying with a smile, "Little guy, are you going to stab me to death with this sword?" Wielding the sword with his hand, no matter how many sword flowers he could wield and how many movements he could employ, he was still immortal. The young disciple of the No Mercy sect felt a bit nervous. More than 100 years ago, he was still an ordinary youth in Yu County. He was brought to the Longevity Mountain by an immortal master after he was discovered to be talented. Unexpectedly, so many significant events had happened in the sect as soon as he entered the mountain gate and received a set of clothes, a sword, and a basic script of sword work. The sect master suddenly came out from behind closed doors, and his master died for some unknown reason. Next, the sect master died as well. Next, the mountain gate was sealed off. Though his master had a high status in a mountain gate, he didn't have a good temperament. As such, he didn't feel sad about his master's death. He felt more bewildered than sad. What made him even more bewildered was that after the mountain gate was sealed off, the elders and big brothers all went to their respective manor caves to cultivate, but nobody paid any attention to him. It was then that he vaguely realized that his master's death might not be honorable. In fact, he had one last chance to leave before the mountain gate was sealed off, but for some reason he chose to stay. Since he didn't have a manor cave of his own, he lived in the guard room next to the Grand Hall. Fortunately, there were a large number of goblins and crystals in the sect, so he didn't have to worry about starving to death, nor did he have to worry about cultivating. The real problem was that he didn't know how to cultivate. All he had was a set of clothes, a sword, and a basic script of sword work. As such, he had practiced the basic script of sword work for more than 100 years with the sword in his hand. As for the set of clothes, he had washed them a long time ago and put them away carefully. It wasn't until today that he was woken up by the commotion in the mausoleum and learned that an enemy had arrived. He put on the set of clothes again and tied the sword to it, walking to the front of the Grand Hall. He had seen his peers ride the flying swords, so he knew that his cultivation state was very low. He also knew that the basic script of sword work wouldn't be very powerful even if he practiced it for 1,000 years. However, his masters and colleagues hadn't woken up yet, so he had no choice but to step forward. Having said that, the Emperor Shao continued walking toward the outside of the mountain. He could fly at the moment, but for some reason, he chose to walk. It was probably because he wanted to see if the young disciple of the No Mercy sect dared draw his sword. The disciple of the No Mercy sect swallowed nervously and dashed toward the Emperor Shao while holding the sword in his hand. The Emperor saw a strange scene from the corner of his eyes, his pupils shrinking a little. The disciple of the No Mercy sect had already moved, but it seemed that he was still standing on the same spot. It was only his figure that had moved. In other words, the movement of the disciple of the No Mercy sect was so fast that a residual shadow could be seen in the shade of the tree. Puff! The sword pierced into the side of the Emperor Zhao's stomach, and then came out from the other side. The fresh blood dripped down slowly from the tip of the sword, dyeing the bright yellow royal robe red. The Emperor furrowed his brows slightly. It was unclear whether he was in pain or thinking of something. "Who are you?" he asked the young disciple of the No Mercy sect incredulously while looking at him. I don't know." The expression on the face of the disciple of the No Mercy sect was quite perturbed. It seemed that he found it even more unbelievable than the Emperor Shao did. He had merely employed the first move of the introductory sword script. How could he have pierced his sword into this person's body? It was unclear whether he thought it was too unbelievable or he thought the scene in front of him was not real. He drew out the sword reflexively. The Emperor Shao sat down on the ground slowly. He sighed while looking at the sword wound on his body and lowered his head helplessly. The gloomy wind blew out from the Grand Hall and landed on the body of the disciple of the No Mercy sect. Along with a rustling sound, his cloth suddenly tore apart, turning into countless strips of cloth hanging down from his body. After more than 100 years, the cloth would have rotted no matter how carefully it was kept. On the contrary, the sword in his hand had become much thinner after being sharpened for more than 100 years, but it was still extremely sharp. No matter how sharp a sword was, it couldn't kill someone like Emperor Shao. It was the sword will of this disciple of the No Mercy sect that had killed him. Over the past 100 years, this disciple of the No Mercy sect had practiced the introductory sword script over and over again. As for the simplicity and purity of the sword will, even Jing Jiao couldn't compare to him. The power of time had proved its greatness in different aspects. The disciple of the No Mercy sect felt bewildered while looking at Emperor Shao sitting on the ground while holding the sword, wondering who this person was. Was he one of the emperors of the previous dynasty in the royal tomb, who had been nurtured by the dark energy for 10,000 years and had turned into a zombie? Otherwise, how could his movement be so stiff and slow? The gloomy wind blew a strip of cloth from his shoulder and touched Emperor Zhao's body gently. Whoosh! Emperor Zhao's bright yellow dragon robe was torn into innumerable pieces, falling into the yellow leaves on the mountain. As the autumn wind blew, the pieces of cloth were indistinguishable from each other. Chapter 726. As long as the time was right, the sword would be sharp enough, and the yellow leaves would fill the sky. Even a young man without a master could become a powerful swordsman. Even the longest and most tiring journey would come to an end eventually. The cloud boats of the Zhongzhou school returned to the Cloud Dream Mountain. Countless waves formed on the clouds and fog outside the mountain, and then they shattered like a dream. When these cloud boats went to the Aoyama the day before, they didn't show any arrogance, but they did show an aura of victory in their silence. But when they returned, it was deathly quiet. No sound could be heard. The fairy Lady by Run had returned to the human world, but she was killed by the queen of the Snowy Kingdom. What frightened them even more was that the immortal sect master had joined hands with the Aoyama sect in an attempt to kill Bai Junren. At this thought, hundreds of gazes fell on the cloud boat in the front reflexively, but they didn't see that tall figure. It was unclear when the immortal Tan had left the cloud boat and returned to the Cloud Dream Mountain. He went to the back of the mountain first and visited a few reclusive elders. Then he stepped on the cloud and went to the deepest part of the great formation of Cloud Dream. In the Aoyama the day before, he was wounded severely by the backfire of the forbidding formation of the Pagoda of Suppressing Devils. It was unclear why he didn't treat his wounds right away after returning to the Cloud Dream Mountain. The clouds and fog dispersed slowly, revealing the huge and dreadful figure of the unicorn. The immortal Tan looked at the unicorn in silence, the expression in his eyes mild and nonchalant. The wrinkles on his broad forehead had disappeared without a trace. The expression in his eyes was quite peculiar, as if he were looking at another place or another time. Of course, he wasn't looking at the unicorn, but that person. In other words, he was looking at the cloud and fog that had never dispersed. They had been brother and sister and later became cultivation partners. They had been together for hundreds of years, but it turned out that they had never truly known each other. All they knew was the scheme hidden in the deepest part of their hearts. Bai Jinren's scheme was hidden more deeply than his, and he started it earlier. As such, his defeat was justified. And if he hadn't been persuaded by the immortal Jingyang, he wouldn't have been tricked by her. Come to think of it, the magic of cloud and fog could be broken by the pagoda of suppressing devils because she asked the unicorn to let it slip on purpose 300 years ago. "How is Sister Yuan?" asked the immortal Tan. The Kirin said, "Why are you pretending to be concerned now? I don't care about your family matters. I just want to ask why you gave the scenic cloud bell to Jingyang." The immortal Tan said, "I didn't give it to him. I gave it to Tong Yin." The Qilin was a little surprised and said, "You actually want to pass the sect leader to that traitor?" The immortal Tan said, "Zhao is still sleeping in Yuan City, and I don't know when or if she will wake up. Besides Tong Yin, who else can I pass the message to?" This was a part of the agreement between him and Jing Jiao. However, Tong Yin still didn't know that Jing Jiao had sold him back to Zhongzhou from Oyama's sect. 2 wisps of fire appeared in the Qilin's eyes as he said, "That traitor actually dared to give the scenic cloud bell to Jingyang. Do you think I will allow him to come back? Would they agree to let him be the sect leader?" The immortal Tan said, "I'm the sect leader of Zhongzhou School. What you say doesn't count." The Qilin laughed wildly and said, "But have you ever thought that I can swallow you whole now that the scenic cloud bell is in Jingyang's hands and you are severely wounded?" The immortal Tan asked, "Look, what is this?" No sooner had he said this than an ancient-looking bell appeared in his palm. It was the scenic cloud bell. The expression in the Qilin's eyes changed abruptly, and he let out a long and dreadful howl. It wasn't because of fear, but because of anger. How many times would the same scene occur? What kind of speed would the escape method of heaven and earth achieve when the fairy energy was used? The warm glow of the spring sun shone on the ground, and the energy ripples hidden in the glow could travel hundreds of miles in an instant. Yet, it was still not as fast as that sword light. Even though the traces left by the sword light had become a bit crooked, and it wasn't as straight as it had been in the beginning. The Guoqing Temple was very close to the East Ocean. When Tong Yin answered the first question of the master of Shui Yununnery, Bai Jinren arrived at the temple along with the sunlight, turning into the fog in the pine forest, and then appeared in front of a meditation room. This meditation room was called White Mountain, and it was the same room where Taiping Jinren and the great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect listened to the scripts. Taiping Jinren had died the day before. The great grandmaster of the mysterious dark sect had died, and the chief monk of the lecture hall of the Guoqing Temple had died, but she was still alive. Bai Jinren walked into the meditation room and looked at the Buddha statue in silence. It was unclear what was on his mind. The melodious sound of the bell echoed in the temple, and the sound of the scripts added a sense of order to the spring scenery. The old abbot of the Guoqing Temple had passed away a few years ago. The Zen master was in the distant snowland, and none of the monks in the temple could sense her arrival. The sound of the bell and the scriptures could conceal her energy, allowing her to rest for a while. There was a vegetable garden outside of the Guoqing Temple. There was an abandoned house in the vegetable garden. There was a half-empty pickle jar in the house. The sword light flashed and went up the cliff. There was a small round hole in the yellow wall of the temple. A gentle wind blew in the kitchen. There were several cracks on the stone beasts in a large hall. The stone pagoda in the tranquil garden was illuminated by the sword light. Jing Jiao showed up, touching the stone pagoda with his hand and looking at the many halls outside. The sound of the bells soon stopped, but the sound of the scriptures continued for a long time. It was unclear whether it was because of the chants mentioned by the Zen sect, or because of the great changes in heaven and earth the day before, but the monks in the morning class were reciting the 3,000 great wishes. This scripture talked about escaping from the sufferings of this world and going to the 3,000 wonderful worlds. The last sentence was, the supreme subtle method, the tribulation of hundreds and thousands. As this sentence of the scripture drifted away with the wind, Jing Jiao and Bai Jinren met again. There was a stone platform outside the White Mountain Meditation Room. On the other side of the stone platform was the forest of pagodas of the Guocheng Temple, where the eminent monks of the past were buried. The old abbot who had passed away a few years ago was buried in the new pagoda at the front. If Taiping Jinren had stayed here as the abbot, he would probably have his own stone pagoda. Jing Jiao flicked his finger lightly, and the ancient bell in a distant hall rang. The sound of the bell again alarmed the monks in the Guocheng Temple. Several clear lights floated up from the forest of pagodas and gathered together, like a cassock fluttering in the wind. It was the great formation of the mountain gate. Bai Jinren couldn't leave, even if he used the escape method of heaven and earth. She had no intention of leaving either. With her hands clasped behind her back, she raised her head and closed her eyes, as if she found the sound of the bell very pleasant. Hundreds of monks came over and surrounded the forest of pagodas. Jing Jiao waved his hand. The monks understood what he meant and retreated outside uneasily. For some reason, he didn't directly transform into the sword light and cut Bai Jinren, who was more than 100 feet away, into pieces. Bai Jinren didn't attack either. The two of them stood in silence in the forest of pagodas. A gentle breeze carrying the faint scent of pine drifted over, tugging at their white robes and white dresses. Crack, 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 crack. Countless crisp sounds came from the depths of Jing Jiao's and Bai Jinren's bodies. Countless cracks appeared on the surface of the stone pagodas, and the wild grass on the ground was cut to pieces. The Buddha statue in the White Mountain Meditation Room had a lot of paint peeling off in a very short time. Even the great formation of the mountain gate in the sky had a very strong reaction. The monastic robe made of emptiness was torn open several times. The sunlight fell down like this, illuminating the stone pagodas like statues on a chessboard. Sensing the dreadful energy drifting in the temple, the monks of the Guocheng Temple kept chanting the name of the Buddha, their faces full of pity. Those energies were neither the sword wills nor the magic methods of Taoism, but they were clearly damaged. They were the wounds inflicted by Jing Jiao and Bai Jinren. Bai Jinren opened his eyes, exclaiming, "How much longer can you run amok?" "I don't know," said Jing Jiao. Back when they were at the West Ocean, Jing Jiao and Nan Chu had a lot of conversations through their spiritual awareness in a very short time. Jing Jiao and the Snow Girl had done the same. But today, Jing Jiao and Bai Jinren were talking for real. It didn't mean anything, but it was because they were both very tired at the moment. After one day and one night, they were exhausted to the extreme, and their wounds were very severe. The golden liquid kept flowing out from Bai Jinren's wounds. If the fairy book hadn't protected her Tao heart, she would have died by the East Ocean. Jing Jiao didn't show any abnormality, but it was hard for him to feel better after being struck by the fairy book in the mausoleum of Longevity Mountain. Bai Jinren looked at Jing Jiao and said, "Is it because of the Aoyama sect or the Jing clan? Your influence on the Guocheng Temple is much greater than I thought." "That's why you shouldn't have chosen this place," said Jing Jiao. Bai Jinren said, "I heard that Lu Shui had lived here for many years, and that your big brother had been the chief monk here for many years, and that your elder brother was buried here." "That's right," said Jing Jiao. Bai Jinren said, "Have you recalled many past events after coming here? Have you ever thought that only those who are about to die would do this? Where does your confidence come from?" asked Jing Jiao. Looking at the spring sun in the sky, Bai Jinren suddenly asked, "What do you think it is?" During the Tao competition back then, Jing Jiao went to the green sky mirror. Many young geniuses traveled with him, like Hejan and that free-traveling practitioner friend of Hejan whose family name was Jiang. By the canal of that poor village in Jiaoyang, those two children had asked a similar question while pointing to the sun in the sky. The sun in the green sky mirror was not the real sun, but the retrieved heavenly orb. As a result, even the children knew that the world they were in was fake. Why did Bai Jinren suddenly ask this question? What answer did he want to hear? Chapter 727. Hearing this question, Jing Jiu thought of the scene by the heavenly well on Longevity Mountain. It was then that the fairy book shone brightly in Bai Jinren's hands. Countless bright lights came from the sky after being summoned by the fairy book, and the source was the sun. In the next moment, he thought of another scene. In the cold and dark world, a white burning fireball hovered in the distance in silence, gazing at this world. The reason Bai Jinren asked him this question was because he had been to that world. I actually don't need your answer, she continued while looking at Jing Jiu. There is a fairy veil on Cloud Dream Mountain through which we can see that world. I've seen the burning fireball many times since I was little, so I know that the sun in this world is not real, or it is merely a projection of the sun. Looking at the spring sun in the sky, Jing Jiu didn't say anything. Bai Jinren continued, why don't the cultivation practitioners have the fairy energy before their ascension? And why do they have the fairy energy after their ascension? Jing Jiu turned his head around and shot her a glance, but still didn't say anything. It's because the burning white fireball exudes the true primeval light, which is the fairy energy. Bai Jinren went on, so you're not my equal. A gust of gentle wind blew over, bringing with it the fragrance of pine trees, tousling the ribbon-like white cloth. Jing Jiu intended to say something, but he shook his head in the end. Don't tell me that I can't use the fairy energy because I'm not an ascendant. Bai Jinren went on calmly. You and I don't even know who we are, so how can we determine what we can and can't do? Many years ago, the whole of Chaotian was at a loss because of the true identity of Jing Jiu. Was he the reincarnation of the immortal Jingyang or the all-in-one sword? Yet what Bai Jinren asked today was not about his own identity, but a deeper issue. It was a question of where did it come from. In fact, both Jing Jiu and the other cultivation practitioners had thought of this issue. The beginning of the cultivation was the Tao inquiry. Looking at the mountains and rivers, the wind and clouds, the stars in the sky, and the sun, he had to ask. Even if you had just entered Aoyama and did not think about it when you were fooling around with your peers by the stream of sword cleansing, even if you had entered the undefeated sword realm and only cared about flying on your sword on both sides of the muddy river, with your face hurting from the cold wind and your body filled with warmth, you would not have the time to think about it. But during the long period of isolated meditation, when you were in the midst of perceiving the big things between life and death, how could you not think about it? Where did this world come from? What kind of rules did it follow? If martial cultivators wanted to ascend, where would they fly to? Immortal world? Where was the immortal realm? To know where to go, you must first know where to come. Why am I here? Why does this world exist? If the sun was fake, would the world be fake too? If this world is fake, will I still be real? Since ancient times, cultivators had pondered this question countless times, but not a single one of them had put their thoughts into words and passed down to the later generations. That was the beginning of the Grand Tao, the direction of the Grand Tao, the door of profundity and the abyss of myriad tribulations. It was the same today. Jing Jiu remained silent throughout. We have no place of origin, and this world has no place of origin. Bai Jinren said, this place has been like this since ancient times, as if this world appeared on a certain day in the river of time. Jing Jiu reached out and plucked a piece of spring scenery. After looking at it for a while, he said, if you can't see clearly from the front, why don't you look back first? At least you can see something. Bai Jinren said, this world is full of the feeling of design. The whirlpools, the passages, and the barriers all seem to be serving this world. This theory is not new. Since ancient times, many people have been searching for the existence of gods until a mighty person finally ascended. Jing Jiu loosened his fingers and let the spring scenery melt into time. He looked at her and said, this world is real, and so are you and I, Bai Junren said, but it could still be a world that was designed to be isolated from the outside world because the outside world is too dangerous. Jing Jiu said, even so, I think that the Creator didn't mean for us to stay in this world. He probably wanted us to grow here until we were strong enough to break through the barriers he had set, and then we should leave. The cradle was indeed safe enough, but if they didn't leave, how could they learn to walk, and how could they walk to the other side? If you and I just leave, what will happen to this world? Bai Junren asked. Jing Jiu said, you really believe what senior brother said? Bai Junren said, that's right. We've both seen the outside world. Grandmother's idea can't solve the fundamental problem, but your senior brother has found a new path. Jing Jiu said, no matter what, he is the master of our Aoyama sect, and your surname is Bai. Bai Junren said to him with a small smile, all things can be a sword. Why can't the paths be interlinked? Taiping Junren was the most formidable demonic person in Chaotian in the last 1,000 years. She, the leader of the Orthodox cultivation circle, was a follower of Taiping Junren. Jing Jiu had known this a long time ago, but he couldn't help but glance at her twice after confirming it. The patch of cloud and fog had dispersed, exposing her face. It was not the face that had appeared in Zhaoga City for a brief moment, nor was it the face that had appeared in the Dao competition. This was her true appearance. Her eyes and brows were exceedingly beautiful, similar to Bai Zeos, but more desolate and otherworldly. Bai Junren asked, do you think she looks like me? Jing Jiu uttered, she does look like me, regardless of her appearance, temperament, talent, and even her view of heaven and earth. Bai Junren continued with a small smile. Back when I saw her pretending to be an adult and befriending the talented young cultivation practitioners, I thought it was funny, as if she was pretending to be a housewife. But after I laughed, I remembered that I had done the same thing many years ago, or in other words, I wanted to do the same thing. She had been the daughter of the sect master of the Zhongzhou school. She was innocent and naive at the time, but she wanted to shoulder the heavy responsibility of the world. However, all she could do was cultivate on the Cloud Dream Mountain every day, waiting to be arranged to be the cultivation partner of the most talented big brother, living a boring life. It wasn't until she went to Zhaoga City with her mother that she witnessed a significant event. The king of the underworld was locked in the fiend prison. Lu Xi served as master drinking wine for a whole night. Then she learned about Lien Sangue. Then the plum meeting took place. She admired them, or rather, she envied them. They are all cultivation practitioners. Why can they live like this, but I have to abide by the rules of the major sects and do nothing? Bai Junren went on, it's because I'm the daughter of the Bai family, and my grandmother is the last descendant in Chaotian, and I'll become the leader of the Orthodox sects in the future. Jing Jiu didn't make any comment, nor did his expression change, be it pity, sympathy, or mockery. I could of course try to get rid of this boring life like little Zao did. For instance, I could go to the Aoyama sect and propose marriage to Lu Xi. Nan Wang hadn't entered the sect yet at that time. Bai Junren continued while folding his hands behind his back, but I'm not interested in this sort of thing. In my opinion, they have already done all the interesting things. What he referred to was people like Taiping and Lien Sangue. Just when I stopped thinking about these things suddenly took a very interesting turn. She pulled back her gaze and said to Jing Jiu, your big brother suddenly changed from an immortal in Chaotian to a demonic person who intended to destroy the world. The topic had dropped from the sky to the ground, but it was still a heavy one because it was very important. Later, I learned of his idea. I thought it was interesting and evil, but it was also correct. Bai Junren went on, the idea of having all three characteristics at the same time is very appealing to me. Jing Jiu asked, if you're his follower, why do you want to kill him? If not for Lu Xi, you would have succeeded at the West Ocean back then. I like his idea, but it doesn't mean that I'm his follower. Why can't I kill him? Bai Junren went on, if I had killed him at the West Ocean, his inheritance in the underworld would have been mine, and this world would have been mine as well. By then, I would have fulfilled his idea. Jing Jiu asked, Have you known all along that he was preparing to do this in secret? I only knew part of it. That's why I asked the Grand Priest to cooperate with him in the underworld in secret. But I didn't expect his idea to be so spectacular when it was put into practice. Bai Jinren said this thoughtfully while looking at heaven and earth. Heaven and earth had been undergoing tremendous changes since last night. The seawater entered the underworld, creating tens of thousands of waves. The saber and the sword collided, creating a mountain range. Eventually, an opening was created. The large Buddha used his body as a dam to block the seawater. The chaotic wind whistled over the surface of the lake. The Rocky Mountains were on the verge of breaking apart, and the golden blood had faded. The saint used his blood as ink to block the strong wind. The huge transparent wall at the bottom of the Gathered Soul Valley collapsed, and the lava sprayed down to the underworld at the bottom of the abyss like the heavenly fire. The green smoke by the East Ocean made the peach blossoms look green again. It was all the work of Taiping Jinren. With heaven and earth as the furnace, with fate as the work, with yin and yang as the charcoal, and with everything as the copper, Bai Jinren sighed with emotion. I can't think of such a method. This sentence is very interesting, said Jingjio. Bai Jinren withdrew his gaze and said, but I have thought further than your big brother. Even if all the mortals in the world were killed, the spiritual energy of heaven and earth would still be limited. Even if we used the great formation of the smoke and clouds, I'm afraid it wouldn't be enough for everyone to ascend. Jingjio said, so you lure Bai Rin back from the outer world? She was worried about this place, but she didn't dare to go too far away. Why did she have to wait outside? Bai Jinren said indifferently. After she came back, she would either kill all of you, or she would be killed by you and Taiping Jinren. She would return the fairy energy to heaven and earth. Either way, it would be a good thing. You and my big brother are really alike, Jingjio said. Bai Jinren looked at him and said, what I don't understand the most is why you came here in person. You aren't like him and me. Everyone in the world knew how lazy and afraid of death Jingjio was. Even if the world where mortals lived was destroyed, it had little to do with him. But he started to risk his life to save the human world. You didn't hesitate to destroy the inherited heaven sword at the cost of the disappearance of the sword formation of Aoyama. You killed Bai Rin and sent the snow girl away. You understood and accomplished all these things. Now, no one can threaten your existence, and you can ascend at any time. But you suddenly turn around and gave up the real freedom that you had planned for so many years. Asked Bai Jinren, looking at the face in the bright spring sunlight. You handed over the sword handle so casually. Don't you think it's absurd? Of course it's not casually. This decision is very important. Jingjio said, I thought about it the whole night. Chapter 728. How important was Jingjio's decision? In other words, it was related to the trend of the entire history of Chaotian. On a smaller scale, it would decide the final success or failure of his 1,000-year cultivation path. Of course, to him, the latter was the most important thing. He had only used one night to make this decision. No matter how one looked at it, it couldn't be said to be serious. In fact, it could even be said to be extremely sloppy. Actually, I really don't care what you guys want to do, but why did I stand up against senior brother when he wanted to do it back then? Jingjio reached out again and plucked a piece of spring scenery. He put it in front of his eyes and looked at it for a while. It was as if he was looking at the hot pot from back then. Since our paths are different, we can't work together. Let's just go our separate ways. But this matter is out of the question because your path has already affected my path. Well water does not interfere with river water. I just want to be a well in peace and silence. But the waves you make in the river are too big and the water is muddy. He had never told his senior brother about this before. He had only told him about it on Tianguang Peak yesterday. Today, he had officially explained it to him. That year, after eating hot pot, he brought Yuan Qijing and Lu Xiai to his senior brother. This was related to the disaster in the Guochang Temple, but the root cause was still different. If it was in the past, if you still wanted to live and cultivate in this world, I can understand your choice. But now that you are inside of the Great Tao, you can just leave. Why bother about this place? Bai Jinren's gaze fell on his fingers, watching the spring scenery that was gently changing shape with the wind. You said earlier that it's wrong to just walk away, Jing Jiao said. And it turns out that even if I leave, it won't end. Bai Run had successfully ascended more than 1,000 years ago. She felt a strong uneasiness when she saw that dark and dangerous world. She didn't go far from it. Instead, she stayed outside Chaotian. That year, he broke through the sky with his sword and went to the outside world. He was severely injured by her sneak attack and had no choice but to use the all-in-one sword to reincarnate. The sneak attack was not the key. The real problem was that he still had karma with this world. Because of the smoke and cloud dispersing formation, and because of himself. In his previous life, Jinren Jingyang had the sharpest and most indifferent Taoist heart in the world. He was like an immortal sword that had been washed by water for 10,000 years, but he still could not cut off the karma. Therefore, after his rebirth, he first went to the small mountain village and found Lu Shui. Then, he returned to Aoyama and brought Zhao Liu to Shenma Peak. He heard the zither music in the plum garden in Zhaoga City and went to the West Ocean to meet Lien Sanyue again. The karma didn't end there. Instead, it became deeper and deeper until it penetrated into his bones and became inseparable from him. Karma needed to be settled. Bai Jinren understood what he meant and said, "This can even make you temporarily forget your fear of death?" Jing Jiao said, "I'm not sure, but I didn't think about these things when I made the decision." Bai Jinren continued to ask, "What about now? Do you feel that darkness?" That patch of darkness was the shadow of death. Jing Jiao said after some thought, "I think so." The reason he felt the shadow of death was because he wasn't sure if he could defeat his opponent. Bai Jinren said calmly, "Let's see whose Dao path is correct then." The judging criteria for the contest of the Dao paths was simple and straightforward. Whoever survived in the end would be correct. This was the meaning of the Dao path. For example, what should the human race do in the future? For example, how should this world exist? It would take a great many years to see the final outcome, and only then would they know if the ideas of Taiping Jinren and Bai Jinren were correct. The monks of the Guocheng Temple had all left. The chanting of the scripts could be heard in the fields, outside the courtyard walls, and among the cliffs. The chanting came to the pagoda forest along with the wind, adding a sense of solemnity to the atmosphere. The fairy energy in the master amulet is too much, and its level is too high. I had to sleep in the chanting of the scripts for many years to temper it. Jing Jiao wasn't reminding her. He was merely narrating it objectively. Bai Jinren had 2 fairy books, one main and one auxiliary. If she could only use the auxiliary fairy book like before, she would be no match for him. Of course, she must have many powerful magic treasures and Taoist magic skills, just like Jing Jiao had the seal of the king of the underworld. But those were not as good as the fairy book and the all-in-one sword. Since they were not good enough, they weren't qualified to participate in today's battle. This is the fairy book of the Bai family. Though I can't temper it, I know more ways to use it. After Bai Jinren said this, his hand suddenly released an unimaginable amount of light. The light came from the burning fairy book. The auxiliary fairy book helped her travel freely between the human world and the underworld with the escape method of heaven and earth, and evade the pursuit of Jing Jiao. Unexpectedly, she directly ignited the fairy book before the battle began. The fact that she could ignite the fairy book was even more shocking. It was because it proved that the Bai family had a great deal of experience in using the fairy book to fight, just as she said. The fairy book was burned into nothingness in a short time. The bright light with endless heat seeped out from the gaps between her fingers, but turned back when it encountered the spring wind. This miraculous scene was something that could not be imagined no matter how one imagined it, before it really happened. Those extremely bright rays of light completely penetrated the white clothes, entered her body, and then disappeared. Her body didn't seem to have experienced any change, but if one looked closely, one would find that her eyes were brighter, and her skin had a thin glow that looked like gold or jade, glinting under the sunlight. Her entire body seemed to have turned into a magic treasure. Jingjiu sensed it clearly. It was not the fairy energy that had modified her Taoist body in a short time. It was the fairy energy that had been dispersed into tiny particles, covering every part of her body and even every part of her internal organs. In a sense, Bai Junren had a golden body similar to Chao Yuan's, which was similar to his sword body. Bai Junren had an indestructible Taoist body at the moment. Those magic treasures and the attacks of the swordsman in the heavenly arrival state couldn't hurt her a bit. She didn't have to worry about being pierced through by the sword light and almost dying on the spot like what had happened by the East Ocean. Her defense had become unimaginably powerful. But what method would she employ to kill Jingjiu, whose defense was even more powerful? Did she really have a way to employ the true fairy book? The sun had reached its zenith, the hottest moment of the day, and the sunlight was exceedingly bright. All of a sudden, countless sunlight beams shot toward the pagoda forest as if they were summoned by a shapeless force. The same scene had happened on Longevity Mountain, but the sunlight beams were thicker this time, looking like a static lightning bolt that had destroyed the great formation of the Guoqing Temple easily. The sunlight beams illuminated the gloomy pagoda forest, as well as Bai Junren's face. Her face was illuminated by the sunlight, not as desolate as before. A few wrinkles appeared at the corners of her eyes, and a strand of black hair on her temples turned white at a visible rate. Was this the price she had to pay to employ the Master Fairy Book? Bai Junren drifted up into the sky amid the sunlight. She looked down at Jingjiu, her eyes devoid of any emotion. Countless sunlight beams shone on the pagoda forest soundlessly, but they didn't scatter. They shrouded Jingjiu like a fence. Many small holes appeared on the green stone slabs, which were the result of the power of the light beams. The light grids emitted an unimaginably formidable energy as they shrank toward Jingjiu. Countless puffs of green smoke arose in the pagoda forest, and the wild grass in the cracks of the stone slabs melted with the wind. Sizzle! A ray of light had finally touched the hem of Jingjiu's white cloth, which was set ablaze. Soon after, a ray of sunlight touched his wrist and made a small cut. No blood flowed out, and the cut was crystal clear like colored glaze. Jingjiu didn't try to run away. No matter how fast the sword light was, it was at most as fast as the sunlight. In this array made up of sunlight, there was not much meaning in dodging. Before Bai Junren employed the fairy book, Jingjiu had started calculating. To be more precise, the moment he was ambushed on Longevity Mountain and saw the sunlight, he began his own deductions and calculations. His final conclusion was very simple. If Bai Junren used only the auxiliary fairy book, he would have a chance of winning. But if she summoned too much sunlight, he wouldn't be able to avoid it, and he wouldn't have any chance of winning. No matter how abundant his sword source was, how could it outlast the endless sunlight? The white fireball, which was floating in the dark and cold world in silence, obviously wouldn't be extinguished even after tens of thousands of years. As such, there was only one way: to cut off the passage through which the fairy book summoned the sunlight. After sneak attacking Bai Junren in the heavenly well by the East Ocean, Jingjiu was more certain of his conclusion. As such, the sword light wrote a few words in the sky. The sword light moved too fast, and the words disappeared as well. Only a few people in Chaotian could see them, like that person in Aoyama. The sunlight in the sky suddenly disappeared. A black mountain suddenly appeared in the sky, blocking the sun. The sunlight shone on its body, turning its black fur into a silver color. The light beams in the pagoda forest of the Guoqiang Temple were still emitting bright light, but they didn't have an endless supply. Bai Junren arched his eyebrows, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes growing deeper. Though she was surprised, she didn't hesitate. She reached out her hand and grabbed the sunlight in the pagoda forest, thrusting it toward Jingjiu. The light grating formed by hundreds of light beams had instantly condensed into a line and landed squarely on Jingjiao. Crack! Innumerable cracking sounds rang out one after another. The big trees and the courtyard walls of the Guocheng temple fell down together, and a human-shaped crack appeared on the bell in a side hall. The ocean waves kept crashing against the rocks by the shore. It was unclear how many years they had been crashing against the rocks, and how many more years it would take for the rocks to break into pieces. Boom! The rocks suddenly broke into pieces and fell into the ocean waves, creating countless raindrops. Jingjiao flew out from the ocean, his body covered in blood. The blood was not diluted by the seawater, but it was dyed golden by the sunlight. Bai Zhenren had knocked Jingjiao to an island 100 miles away with one punch. Looking at the land on the other side of the ocean, Jingjiao waved his hand. A few desolate sword lights left his fingers and returned to the Guocheng temple after passing the ocean surface in a distance of 100 miles. Pa! 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 A few invisible dents appeared on Bai Zhenren's clothes. Some blood seeped out. It was also golden. Chapter 729. When the disciples of Aoyama reached the perfect preservation state, their sword would become more solid and pure. Their flying swords would be able to cut through rocks and gold. Within 100 feet, they would be able to control the swords as if they were their own arms and fingers. Wherever they looked, they could kill. If one cultivated to the inherited conception realm and formed a sword pellet, the sword would be awe-inspiring, and the flying sword could come and go freely within 1,000 feet. From a state of undefeated to the state of free travel, he could control his flying sword to kill people more than 10 miles away. If he reached the broken sea state, his sword would be so powerful that his flying sword could cross the sea and behead a swordsman from 100 miles away. If he was like Pei Baifa in the past, he would be able to reach the Heaven Ascension realm with his flying sword. However, even if they were as powerful as the Supreme Being, it would still take some time for their flying swords to reach their target, and they also needed to know where the target was. Jingjiao waved his hand, and the sword light left his body and went to the Guocheng temple hundreds of miles away, accurately landing on Bai Zhenren's body. What kind of realm and sword cultivation was this? Several sword lights broke through the waves and disappeared on the shore. He moved again. He stretched out his right hand and chopped downwards. An extremely bright sword light appeared in the void. A straight white line appeared on the surface of the sea. The front end of the white line was heading towards the Guocheng temple hundreds of miles away at an unimaginable speed. The sound of chanting could be heard. The pagoda forest was bright, a stark contrast to the dark sky. The sword light pierced through the air, slicing through the temple walls and the pagoda forest. It fell into the depths of the light and forced out a white figure. Bai Zhenren, who was about to use the heaven and earth escape technique to escape, was actually slashed out by this sword. She looked at the distant east sea. Her eyes were still indifferent, but there was a hint of determination in them. Jingjiao was seriously injured, but he still had such a powerful battle strength. That sword light came from hundreds of miles away and could accurately hit her. However, her Taoist magic and fairy book didn't have such precision. She had to shorten the distance between her and Jingjiao. All of a sudden, the pagoda forest shone brightly and swallowed her figure. She moved against the sword light that was drifting toward her from the sea. 10 breaths later, she arrived above the sea. Her right hand shone with boundless light as it pressed down on Jingjiao. Jingjiao's expression did not change as he waved his hand again. The sword light cut through the air and left 2 clear sword marks on Bai Zhenren's neck and ankle. With the help of the fairy book, it was as if she had a golden body. Even the all-in-one sword couldn't break it instantly. Pa! 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 Countless sounds of thunder could be heard. In an extremely short period of time, thousands of sword lights left Jingjiao's hands and arrived in the world. The light tore down the dark clouds, passed through the woods, passed over the sun hidden by the black mountains, flew over the distant sea like blue satin and over the near sea like white silk. At a certain moment, the lights seemed to turn into countless flying swords that pierced through the sky. Bai Jinren stood there and lowered his head to look at his body. He raised his eyebrows as he looked at the extremely fine sword holes on his body. Back in Zhaoga City, the replica of the fairy Lady Bai Run had done something similar when it was destroyed by the sword formation of Aoyama. She had kept that scene in mind. She didn't expect that it would happen to her again after so many years. The fairy book was still glowing in her hand. However, those sword lights had pierced through her body like raindrops before it could touch the hem of Jingjiu's cloth. Those sword lights were not the sword formation of Aoyama. It was just that the sword moved so fast that it looked as if tens of thousands of sword lights had appeared at the same time. In other words, the sword had turned himself into a sword formation of Aoyama. A patch of cloud 10 miles away was smashed into pieces, and Jingjiu showed up. He spun around to look in that direction and saw the immortal by falling down from the sky and into the ocean. But it didn't cause too much of a commotion. Even an important figure who could change heaven and earth was no different from a stone when he fell into the sea. As the sea wind blew slightly, Jingjiu came to this patch of the sea. The tattered white cloth was wet by the sea water, looking like a sail torn by a storm. Jingjiu stood on the surface of the sea and looked at Bai Jinren in silence. The sea water here was exceedingly deep, but for some reason, it looked exceedingly clear, looking like a small stream. The most amazing part was that the sea water within a few square miles seemed to be still. Bai Jinren drifted in the sea water, as if she were lying in a crystal. A great deal of golden fairy energy came out from her body and entered the sea slowly, vanishing without a trace soon after. She looked at the sun blocked by the dead dog in the sky with her eyes wide open, reflecting on something. The battle only lasted for a short period of time. She had aged a great deal during this time, and her face was full of wrinkles. As the fairy energy in the fairy book dispersed, the wrinkles disappeared again. Her face was as beautiful as before, and the expression in her eyes was as cold as ever. "The Night Howler is more powerful than I had imagined," she said while looking at the black mountain in the sky. It was rumored in the cultivation circle that the two divine animals of the Zhongzhou school, the unicorn and the old dragon, were the most powerful beings. Of the four principal guards of Aoyama, the dead dog was the only one who could resist them. Yet the dead dog had blocked the original light borrowed from the outside world by relying on his own magic. It was evident that his cultivation state had surpassed the unicorn a long time ago. Jingjiu said, "He has been guarding the sword jail all year round, so few people know how powerful he is, and he doesn't need to be known by others." The fight was over, and the fairy book was destroyed, and a great deal of fairy energy was flowing into the ocean. As a result, the dead dog had no need to block the sun any longer. The black mountain in the sky moved away slowly, and the edges of the mountain suddenly became brighter, like the fireworks in the daytime. Then, everything returned to normal, and the sunlight shone on the ground again. "I feel this scene is familiar, as if I have seen it somewhere before," Bai Jinren said confusedly while looking at the magnificent scene in the sky. "I also feel that I have heard it somewhere before," Jingjiu said. The black mountain was still moving slowly in the sky. It seemed that the dead dog had paid a great price to block the original light from the outside world. Bai Jinren pulled back his gaze and looked at Jingjiu, saying, "The competition of the path toward heaven is actually not important. All I want is to live an interesting life like Taiping and Lien Sanyue." Jingjiu said, "It's actually a sad thing to live like them." "You're really a boring person," said Bai Jinren. Jingjiu said, "The more interesting it is, the sadder it is, and the sadder it is. Knowing that one's life would come to an end sooner or later, one would pursue something interesting and meaningful until it was the only thing one could pursue." Bai Jinren understood what Jingjiu meant, but he asked uncertainly, "Have you never thought that you would die? Not even once?" Ascension was not the same as longevity. It was merely a stage of pursuing longevity. However, Few cultivation practitioners in Chaotian had ascended in the history of cultivation. Where did Jing Jiao get his confidence that he would ascend and that his life would never come to an end? I had thought that I might die in the Guochang Temple, Jing Jiao went on. As such, I've been trying to avoid such a choice, or to put myself in such a predicament. Bai Jinren said, nobody can guarantee that they will live forever. If you live such a boring life, wouldn't it be a great loss if you suddenly died one day? Standing on the surface of the ocean, Jing Jiao looked at this world, thinking of bathing in the lava and fishing in the clouds. He didn't say anything. Bai Jinren said, you still can't solve the problem. It's impossible to prove immortality. Yes, it's like a question. There's no answer. Jing Jiao went on, but I've been trying to solve this question. Isn't this the most enjoyable part of living? That's why. It's indeed sensible. Unfortunately, you're the only one who is qualified to enjoy this pleasure. Bai Jinren was quite satisfied with this explanation. He let out a smile and then closed his eyes calmly. The clear and still ocean water started to flow slowly, looking like glass and crystal. A small bubble formed due to the friction and crowding of the ocean water. In the next moment, more and more bubbles formed in the ocean water and drifted to the surface of the ocean. Gradually, they gathered together and became foams. The white foams gathered together to form a sprays. Countless sprays appeared out of nowhere, spreading in all directions. It was unclear when they would disperse. Whether it was a spring rain, a sky full of morning light, or the endless twilight, they all represented the departure of a truly great figure. Unlike the previous times, the countless sprays on the ocean were not seen by anybody. Yet, the whole of Chaotian had sensed the departure of Bai Jinren. The Black Mountain had gone back, bringing a great deal of coolness to the peaks of Aoyama. As the mountain wind blew slightly, the dead dog landed on the spot where the Shangda Peak used to be. He crouched on the huge black jade plate in silence and started resting with his eyes closed. A great deal of fresh blood seeped out from the black skin and hair, and the dreadful wounds could be vaguely seen. It was then that the people in Aoyama realized that the dead dog had been wounded severely. As a few sword lights flashed, Guang Yuan, Jinren, Nen Wang, and the others came to the front of the dead dog, but they didn't know how to treat his wounds. A dandelion suddenly appeared in the dark mountain field. Ada landed on the dead dog's body and started licking his wounds gingerly. Nan Wang and the others had all gone to the dead dog's place, and fewer people were left on the Sword Peak. Now that the matter had been settled, there was no need to keep an eye on Ping Yongka. Ping Yongka didn't open his eyes. He sat in the cliff cave with a pale face, his finger pointing in the direction of the East Ocean. The green girl stroked his scalding forehead, worried that this guy's brain might have been fried by the unimaginably large amount of calculations. The moment her hand touched his forehead, countless flying swords on the cliff and in the sky suddenly moved and aimed at her. Qing understood the reason, and she had a better understanding of Zhao Liu's fear of her. She snorted unpleasantly and flew out of the clouds and fog on the Sword Peak while flapping her transparent wings. She arrived at a high spot in the sky and looked at the East Ocean. She was certain that the blood-red sword light had gone far away. She was indeed unhappy at the moment, but the reason was complicated, and she couldn't even explain it clearly. Zhao Liu was most afraid of Ping Yongka at the moment, and she was most afraid of Bai Jinren over the years. She should have felt relieved that Bai Jinren was dead. But why did she feel so stifled? It was the same as when Taiping Jinren died the day before. The ocean waves came one after another, like 1,000 piles of snow. Standing in the midst of the snowy waves, Jing Jiao fell silent for a while. Then he changed into a new cloth and leapt up by treading on the waves. He turned into a sword light and headed to the farther part of the ocean. It didn't take long for him to arrive above the huge whirlpool. The giant was soaked to the skin. He kept on digging the cliff rocks by the whirlpool in an attempt to stop the seawater from pouring down, but his efforts were in vain. He looked to be in a sorry state. Jing Jiao indicated that he would do it himself. Now that Bai Zhenren was dead and the fairy book was destroyed, Jing Jiu sensed that even Emperor Shao had turned into yellow leaves for some unknown reason. As such, it was time to save this world. I've used the title of this chapter too many times, but I can't help it. It's because it's so suitable for today. Chapter 730. As Bai Zhenren once said in the Guocheng Temple, this world was not absolutely natural. For example, the three huge whirlpools on the ocean were hard to explain from the point of view of the law of nature. Endless seawater fell from the whirlpools and went to the alien land and the bottom of the ice field in the far north through the passage of heaven and earth. Even the simplest way of looking at it would be problematic. Was the so-called passage of heaven and earth really formed naturally? These questions did not need to be answered now. What Jing Jiu needed to solve now was how to block the passage of the sea to the underworld. Taiping Zhenren used the heavenly slaying formation of the Bloody Demon Church to change the passage of heaven and earth by force. Bai Zhenren used the real body of the pagoda of suppressing devils to strengthen the heavenly slaying formation, directly turning the passage of the sea to the underworld into a huge hole. Even the giant could not do anything at this time because there was too much seawater falling into the underworld. No matter what he put in, it would be washed away. Even if the cultivators moved the mountain gate formation into the huge whirlpool, they could not resist the power of heaven and earth. Unless they could think of a way to slow down the speed of the seawater falling, they could not make up for it. It was like a river bursting its banks. To block the breach, they had to first find a way to slow down the speed of the flood. What was Jing Jiu going to do? A beam of sword light illuminated the huge waterfall formed by endless seawater. The seawater was mixed with blood and sand from the bottom of the sea and from afar. The waterfall looked very muddy, but it was still illuminated and even penetrated by the sword light. The sword light flew quickly among the seawater. It was difficult to determine its specific direction, and there was no pattern. Sometimes it went deep into the sand at the bottom of the sea, leaving countless small holes. Sometimes it entered the bottom of the huge whirlpool and even reached the sky of the underworld. Sometimes it seemed to appear in several places at the same time. Countless bubbles appeared in the seawater, looking like white lines. The white lines were weak, but they emitted extremely pure and condensed sword wills. As the sword light penetrated, the sword wills became more and more dense. After the bubbles dissipated, they still stayed between the sky and the sea, between the human world and the underworld. The falling seawater met the sword wills and naturally separated, turning into transparent pieces of seawater. They collided and rubbed against each other, creating more bubbles and slowing down the falling speed. But it was still far from enough to fill the sea. The hard rocks that were covered with sand and mud at the bottom of the sea were cut into pieces by the sword light. Along with the seawater, they fell into the huge whirlpool like feathers, unable to stay for even a moment. As a result, the sword light became faster and faster. Within a few breaths, it could circle the great whirlpool countless times, going back and forth between the surface of the sea and the sky of the netherworld more than 10 times. The invisible lines formed by the sword wills became denser and denser, gradually forming a net. The mesh also became smaller and smaller, and the suction force between the sword wills was finally able to trap some of the seawater. However, as the falling speed of the seawater slowed down, the weight of the net weaved by the sword intent increased. It became more difficult for the sword light to maintain its current high speed. The giant stood outside the great maelstrom and looked at the sword light that seemed to be carrying an immeasurable weight. His honest face was full of worry. With a soft swoosh, the sword light swept past the edge of the great whirlpool, bringing down some crushed stones. It was obvious that the flight had gone out of control. The giant could no longer control himself and called out Aya. Thunderous shouts drowned out the sound of the waterfall. He was trying to persuade Jing Jiu to give up. Jing Jiu had done too many things in one day and one night. He fought against Taiping Zhenren in the Hermit Peaks, used the sword-washing stream as a whip to trap the fairy lady Bai Run, and fought the final battle against Bai Zhenren, who had the fairy book in his hand. The sword light could be seen everywhere from the netherworld to the human world. He was exhausted to the extreme, and he was severely wounded. Under such circumstances, if he still tried to block the entire ocean with his sword wills, something bad would happen to him. Regardless of how abundant his sword source was, and the fairy energy given to him by Lien Sanyue, all of them would be used up. What would happen to him then? The sword light didn't stop there. Jing Jiu kept moving forward in silence, as if he hadn't heard the shout of his friend the giant. Jing Jiu's sword light was a bit unstable after he was sneak attacked by Zhenren and Emperor Shao in the royal tomb of Longevity Mountain. At the moment, he was carrying the weight of the entire ocean, so he flew in a crooked manner, bumping into some places from time to time. He looked like a drunkard, staggering along the way. However, no matter how unsightly he looked, he kept on flying and building his sword formation in an attempt to block the ocean falling into the netherworld. Looking at the sword light that was getting slower and more unstable, the worry in the giant's eyes grew heavier, and he was also puzzled. You shouldn't be this kind of person. He kept switching the thick ancient tree between his two hands. He almost picked up the ancient tree and smashed it against the sword light a few times in an attempt to stop Jing Jiu, but he didn't do it in the end. The seawater was pierced through hundreds of thousands of times, and the bottom of the cliff was cut into countless pieces. After an unknown amount of time, when the sun set in the west and the seawater was illuminated with a warm red color, like blood, the sword light finally came to a stop. Jing Jiu stood on a cloud in the deepest part of the twilight, looking down at the surface of the ocean. His face was so pale that neither paper nor the snow in White Town could describe it. But it was not easy to see it, because it was illuminated by the setting sun. The ocean water in the huge whirlpool had calmed down a great deal. A great deal of water was still falling into the netherworld, but it was not as violent as before. The net woven by the shapeless sword wills had trapped an unimaginable amount of seawater. If someone were to look up from the netherworld, they would see a huge blue ball of water. It was a miraculous sight. It was a miraculous sight. Looking at Jing Jiu on the cloud, the giant's eyes were full of admiration. This was not the end. To completely block off the passage from the ocean to the netherworld, Jing Jiu still had to do many things. Right now, he had to accomplish one thing, which was to tie the shapeless sword net between heaven and earth. Otherwise, the seawater would rush into the netherworld along with the sword net. The shapeless sword net was woven by the sword wills, and the sword wills were the threads. At the end of the thread was an extremely fine sword will, which was winding around the little finger of his right hand. In other words, the weight of the seawater in the sword net was carried by him. It was impossible for him to carry such a heavy object until the people of Chaotian arrived. In fact, he couldn't hold it for too long. The fine sword will had already sunk deep into the little finger of his right hand. It had even broken the skin and flesh, and a part of the finger bone had been broken. The only thing that could compete with the all-in-one sword was its sword will. It was for this reason that he couldn't tie the sword will to the rocks at the bottom of the ocean. Those rocks would be sliced into pieces by his sword will. What he needed to do now was to find a thicker thread to tie this huge sword net to heaven and earth. But what kind of thread could withstand the sword will of the all-in-one sword? Everything in the world had its own cause and effect. Of course, it could also be said that it was all a coincidence. Of course, you could also say that it was all a coincidence. Jing Jiu happened to know of a kind of thread that could withstand the sword will of the all-in-one sword, and was extremely strong. The twilight grew darker, looking as red as blood. The twilight grew darker, looking as bloody as blood. He reached out his left forefinger and placed it on his waist. Fresh blood oozed out from the tip of his finger. The skin was cut open, and the flesh and blood were separated, exposing the jade-like white bones. Some foreign objects could be vaguely seen in the white bones, which seemed to be some threads. Jing Jiu picked up the white threads with his fingertip and then connected them to the sword while on the little finger of his left hand. Lien Sanue's sneak attacked the godly swordsman of West Ocean at the bottom of the West Ocean more than 100 years ago. She hadn't recovered her original cultivation state and prowess at the time. Instead, she fell into the trap of the godly swordsman of West Ocean and was wounded severely by a swing of the sword. Jing Jiu was hit by the godly swordsman of West Ocean with all his might as he fled from the bottom of the ocean. He was wounded even more severely, and his whole body was almost cut in half. On the sandy beach filled with the shadows of the trees and starlight, Jing Jiu used the sword of the universe as a needle and Lien Sanue's natural worm silk as a thread to stitch up his spine and internal organs. The natural worm silk had been in his body for more than 100 years. This was the cause and effect that were deeply rooted in his bones. The natural worm silk had lived with his sword will for 100 years, so it was impossible for it to be damaged by the sword will. Moreover, it had been nurtured for 100 years, so it was hard to imagine how strong it was. Boom! The ancient tree that had been soaked in the seawater for a great many years was inserted into the hard bottom of the ocean by the giant. The sword light moved around the tree. Jing Jiu had wound the natural worm silk around the ancient tree many times. All he needed to do now was to tie a knot. He tied a peach flower. There was a peach tree in front of Shui Nunnery. Many years ago, Jing Jiu went to visit Lien Sanue when she was unconscious. He picked a flower from the peach tree and placed it by her face. Later in Zhaoga City, Lien Sanue put the peach flower on her temple. It looked beautiful. Today, the peach flower made of the natural worm silk was drifting in the ocean water, looking beautiful as well. Looking at the peach flower, Jing Jiu remained silent for a while. Then, he passed out, drifting in the ocean water helplessly. A shadow blocked the twilight and broke through the ocean water. The giant was about to pick him up from the bottom of the ocean with his hand. A blood-red sword light appeared. Zhao Liu held him in her bosom. The badly damaged, thoughtless sword sank slowly to the bottom of the ocean. Chapter 731. The sword net was vast. No matter how sharp and dense those thread-like sword wills were, they couldn't block all the seawater. The momentum of the sea was not as terrible as before, but it was still dripping like a wet towel that was being wrung tightly. It looked like it was about to dry up, but it was still dripping. The next thing to do was to spread stones and sand on the invisible sword net of dozens of miles, and then use formations or amulets to condense them into blocks. It was like building a crust at the bottom of the giant whirlpool. The ancestor of the giant was responsible for dredging the passage between heaven and earth, so he was good at it. He knelt down in the sea and kept digging out large stones and sand from behind him, and then carefully placed them on the sword net. From a distance, it looked like a mountain on the sea, but it was swaying in the wind. His palms were very big, and each rock he held was a small mountain. At this speed, it wouldn't take him long to block the passage from the sea to the underworld. The problem was that the number of rocks at the bottom of the sea was limited. It didn't take long for him to reach the bottom, and he almost made another hole, so he had to find another place. As the twilight deepened, the giant moved slowly on the surface of the sea, bringing up countless huge waves and digging out countless huge stones. It was unknown when he could fill up the sea. In the underworld, the mountains and rivers that stretched for hundreds of miles blocked the seawater that flowed to the underworld river. There was a huge gap in the gap, and a Buddha sat there, motionless despite the crashing of tens of thousands of waves. Eventually, some seawater flowed into the distance along the cracks between the rocks, and wisps of green smoke rose from the underworld river. Dead bodies were everywhere on both sides of the river. The sergeants of the two major forces of the underworld and the innocent people fled, crying and screaming, but it was unknown if they could escape from this disaster. The two greatest and the greatest people in the world were saving the world silently and alone. No one knew where the most indifferent and silent person who had saved the world had gone. The twilight faded and the night deepened. The sky was full of stars, shining on the dark surface of the sea, making the rumbling sound of the water even more frightening. The starlight in the sky was slightly bent, and someone finally arrived. It was a sage. Bu Xiaoxiao had become a saint the day before. To block the passageway of the chaotic wind entering the underworld, he had exhausted all his efforts. Then he was sneak-attacked and severely wounded by Baizhenren. But he was still the first one to arrive here. Fresh blood covered the cloth, but when the starlight shone on it, there was not the slightest smell of blood or baleful aura. Instead, it seemed incomparably holy. The giant took a look at Bu Xiaoxiao, thinking that this human was quite powerful, but he couldn't solve the problem alone. Bu Xiaoxiao was a bit startled to see the giant. Watching what he was doing, Bu Xiaoxiao suddenly felt a sense of admiration. But he thought that the two of them might not be able to fill this ocean. Suddenly, several sword lights appeared on the horizon. They were Guang Yuan Zhenren, Nan Wang, and three elders whom Bu Xiaoxiao didn't know. But, judging from their sword wills, he could tell that they were also the heavenly or rival figures of the Aoyama sect. The giant was very familiar with the sword will of Aoyama, and he had a natural sense of intimacy with it. He shouted, "Aya," at the sword lights. A few sword lights turned around and returned to the bottom of the ocean 100 miles away, starting to cut the ocean. The sharp sounds of the flying swords cutting the ocean sounded muffled and booming after being blocked by the ocean water. Bu Xiaoxiao understood what the giant meant and flew to the other side. He joined hands with the cultivation colleagues of the Aoyama sect to move the mountain and fill the ocean. The stars in the sky didn't blink. They gazed at the surface of the ocean calmly or nonchalantly, as if they were mocking the futile efforts of those lives. After a long while, the stars seemed to have grown tired and disappeared into the morning sunlight. The morning sunlight grew brighter, and time went by. As dusk arrived, a few more sword lights and a dozen light rays of the magic treasures arrived from the other side of the ocean. It was Chao Tian on the other side. The swordsmen of various sects had arrived here one after another. Even the unstable Zhongzhou school had sent an elder in the Lianshu state. Seeing the giant as large as a mountain, these cultivation practitioners felt terrified and were about to attack reflexively. But they were stopped by Bu Xiaoxiao, who asked them to follow the giant's instructions and move the mountains at the bottom of the ocean to fill the ocean. The elder in the Lianshu state of the Zhongzhou school spoke to Bu Xiaoxiao in a low voice. By now, Bu Xiaoxiao knew that the civil strife at the Zhongzhou school had come to an end. The immortal Tan had always kept a low profile and was mild. But unexpectedly, he acted so decisively this time. He suppressed the unicorn at the back of Cloud Dream Mountain and killed Ren Qianzhu and a few other elders, stabilizing the situation in a short time, regardless of his severe injury. The immortal sect master is severely wounded. It will take him 100 days to get here, the elder in the Lianshu state said in a low voice. Looking at the huge whirlpool below, Bu Xiaoxiao displayed a worried expression in his eyes, wondering if the sword net left by the immortal Jingyang could hold up for 100 days. The dusk faded away, and the night came again. The stars kept on coming out to mock the human world. The mountains at the bottom of the ocean were cut off by the flying swords and the magic treasures, and then brought to the huge whirlpool. The giant crushed them into pieces and scattered them on the sword net. Bu Xiaoxiao stopped moving the mountains and filling the ocean. Sitting in the cloud above the huge whirlpool, he used the blood of the saint to write amulets on the sword net, making the broken stones and silt on the sword net become one. The swordsmen of the cultivation circle continued to save this world in silence. Nobody took a look at the stars because they didn't have the time and didn't care about it. The morning sunlight illuminated the surface of the ocean again, making it look red and warm. A redder lotus cloud appeared on the horizon. Zen Master had finally arrived from the distant snowland. The exhausted Bu Xiaoxiao felt refreshed when he saw the scene. In the next moment, he saw an unforgettable scene. Countless sword lights and magic treasures were flying over from the horizon, along with dozens of sword boats and cloud boats, and of course the boat of diligent study of Yamatsai. In the distance, hundreds of godly boats from Penglai Island were also heading this way, leaving hundreds of white sprays on the blue surface of the ocean. It was a magnificent scene. As this world was on the verge of destruction, all the human cultivation practitioners had arrived, including some powerful demons. Though their prowess was not as powerful as that of Bu Xiao, Nen Wang, and the others, they had the advantage in numbers. As long as they kept at it, the ocean would be filled up one day. The seawater that had fallen into the underworld had overflowed that mountain range 2 days ago. The seawater that had flowed to the two ends of the mountain range turned into countless tiny streams and flowed toward the underworld river. The large Buddha was walking in the swampy fields while heaving a huge iron broadsword. His mottled face displayed a calm expression, devoid of much grief. It was probably because he was breathing constantly in an attempt to swallow all the green smoke into his stomach, so he couldn't show too much emotion on his face. On the distant Black Mountain, a great number of inhabitants of the underworld were hiding in the cliff caves, crying while hugging each other. The short sensei was trembling, wondering when the dreadful green smoke would be blown here by the wind. The Grand Priest was dead, and the severely wounded underworld master was nowhere to be found. The swordsmen of the underworld had also suffered a great deal of casualties and had fled in different directions. Nobody paid any attention to these pitiful inhabitants of the underworld. The seawater that had fallen into the underworld the second time didn't have much contact with the underworld river, and most of the green smoke stayed on the ground. Only a small part of it rose up into the sky, passing through the heavenly well along with the gentle wind. A figure dropped down from the green smoke. Her colorful clothing was very eye-catching in the dark and gray world. Ah Piao showed up in a dazzling manner. Countless gazes were fixed on her in the sky, including those hidden in the dark with complicated emotions. Over the last 100 years, she had lived here as the king of the underworld. But many inhabitants of the underworld, besides the subordinates of the underworld master, didn't want to accept her identity, especially the swordsman on the side of the Grand Priest, because she didn't have the seal of the king of the underworld. The wind and rain were rare in the underworld, but the strong wind suddenly howled and tousled her black hair, which shot backward like a sharp arrow. It was because she had an object in her hand. Judging from the shape of the object, it was a jade seal. It was dark and gloomy, exuding an unimaginable magic energy. This was the seal of the king of the underworld, who had left the underworld a few hundred years ago. Sensing the energy that couldn't be forged, many inhabitants of the underworld ran out from the caves and behind the trees, regardless of the threat of the green smoke. They knelt on the ground and kowtowed to Ah Piao in the sky, crying and begging the king of the underworld to save her people. Looking at the world between the Black Mountains and the clear waters and the suffering populace, the drifter revealed an indignant expression in her eyes. Looking at those remote places, she yelled in a deep voice, "Get the hell out of here!" After a long while, an underworld general exuding a gloomy and cold energy walked out from one of the residences and knelt on the ground with a thud. In the next moment, more and more surviving swordsmen of the underworld walked out, including those who had been loyal to the Grand Priest. "Come with this emperor." Ah Piao flew toward the distance expressionlessly. Hundreds of swordsmen of the underworld hurriedly followed. Along the way, more swordsmen of the underworld appeared and joined this group. The field in front of them had already turned into a swamp, and the seawater continued to flow forward. That giant Buddha walked among them, holding an iron broadsword in his hand, constantly moving the mountain. Looking at that figure, all the swordsmen of the underworld revealed an expression of fear and admiration. "Follow the Lord Broadsword Saint and repair the mountain," Ah Piao said. A swordsman of the underworld said, "No matter how long the mountain is, it will eventually be bypassed by the seawater." Ah Piao said, "Idiot, don't you know how to connect this mountain into a circle?" That swordsman of the underworld said helplessly, "Your Majesty, even if we connect it into a circle, if the seawater does not stop falling, it will eventually overflow the top of the mountain." Apiao looked up at the sky, which was still pouring rain, and said, "That will depend on when the human race can stop it." There was no sun or stars in the underworld, so it was difficult to determine the flow of time. After an unknown number of days, the downpour from the sky suddenly lessened. Then, at a certain moment, without any warning, it completely disappeared just like that. Thousands of swordsmen of the underworld were exhausted to the extreme, and some of them even died of exhaustion. They were in a trance, so they couldn't react in time. Chao Yuan pulled back his iron broadsword and lifted his head slowly to look at the sky. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, revealing a happy smile. The passage leading to the underworld from the sea was blocked. The people of the underworld didn't know what had happened until a long time later, or rather, they believed that something had happened. The first thing that broke out was not the cheers, but the cries, which rose up into the sky. It was the cries of people who had survived a calamity and escaped from death. The seawater that had fallen into the underworld had formed a large lake surrounded by the interconnected mountain ranges. This large lake had no scenery to speak of, but it was vast and boundless. The underworld called it Huluan. It meant a lake as big as the sea. Apiao came to the shore of Huluan Lake. Looking at the blue seawater, she thought of her teacher, who had a mind as broad as the sea. "Teacher, where are you?" The second last sentence can be used to slap the dog's head. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.